Hi everybody, I'm Rudyard the Woodafaltist guy, and before you watch this video, I have to add a couple different preambles for all of our collective sanity. You'll see why. And I'm gonna keep saying that in this intro section. Things will make sense at the end that did not make sense at the start. And to go through this stuff, firstly, there's lots of stuff in this video where, as I wrote it, I didn't know how, because human words cannot convey it. And the way I feel giving you this video is I'm trying to explain something that cannot be explained in words, which is intensely difficult. And so when I try to tell you something, I wish I could show it to you, but I have to write words. And the narration style for this will jump from first to third person. That's annoying for you to listen to and annoying for me to write, but it'll also make sense at the end. This story will also emphasize lots of details which seem really unimportant, but will also make sense at the end. And certain parts of the story will make me, in the way it's narrated, look like a complete narcissistic egomaniac. I apologize for that. But again, it will make sense at the end. And parts may come across as wildly masturbatory. You'll see with that word. But again, as I said, it will make sense at the end. The story will also get unbelievably brutal. I would tell you to not watch this video if you can't handle that sort of thing. But to be frank, your grandpa fought in World War II. He was fine. He saw worse stuff. And I'm choose not to put the 18 plus rating here because I had to live with this crap as a kid. And if I lived through it, you can watch it. Also, for your ancestors, their kids saw their parents fuck, they saw them kill animals, they saw war, they saw famine. If your ancestors' kids can see bad stuff, you can. They're not going to die. So I understand why YouTube would put a 18 plus rating on it, and I respect your decision. It's your company. You have responsibility for it. I don't. But I'm just going to throw the appeal out. This video's length is also pretty insane. Coming from a media background, I didn't want to do it, but at the end of the video, you'll see why that makes sense. This is the shortest period of time I could convey the things I had to convey you to. You should also process this video as if I'm a bard 2,000 years ago, where this is one of the lengthy multi-hour sagas where, like the Nibelungliad, they would say it for an entire week. And so I will change my dress. I will change the framing. It will be on different days because I frankly just can't record this video in a single day. And I understand that some of the ways I shoot and stuff won't be perfect, but it doesn't need to be. If you hear the message, that's enough. And so we'll change. I think that's symbolic of my life. I'm the same person, but I change my clothes and I change my circumstance over the course of my life. Everything in the story is 100% true. You have my word before God, my ancestors, and myself that it's all true. That will also make sense at the end. So this is pretty cool. I'm glad that you folks will get to watch this video. This is going to be a lot of fun. Peace. I, Rudyard William Lynch, was born on June 23, 2001, in Manchester by the Sea, Massachusetts, to my parents Mark Lynch and Leslie Payne Zimmer. Our current era of history completely discounts genealogy, which is one of the most deranged things you can do, since genealogy is the code which imprints who you are through your blood. Then once that's imprinted on your environment, the underlying code adapts to different situations. So when you can see someone's genealogy and ancestors, you see the previous actions their underlying code has done before. So let's go through my ancestors. My father's ancestry comes from almost all Ireland, apparently genetically from the south and the west of the country, which is the normal region for Irish Americans. They moved over after the potato famine in the early 1850s and around the time of the American Civil War. Some went to Quebec first, but then they ended up in the American Northeast, with my grandfather growing up in Jersey City and my grandmother in Boston. My family were police for at least 4 or 5 generations straight in Jersey City, which was one of the best jobs the Irish could get. The Irish lived in ghettos with each other in some of the poorest areas and were seen as an ethnic minority. They seized control of the local bureaucracies, and the Irish had control of the police, the city government, and they had stuff like Tammany Hall, which controlled the politics of the Northeast. My father's line has a strange curse that each male must pick an impossible battle. My father told me growing up that the only thing that matters in life is honor, and if I lived with honor, then it didn't matter what money I made or the rest of my life. At least I was a man who had honor. And he said growing up that your status as a man is determined by do you hold your word and do you die on the hills you need to die on. And to be a lynch, by definition, is to put your own honor above your life, which is the highest virtue a human can do. Honor culture is an integral part of Celtic society going back thousands of years, which Thomas Sowell has written a tremendous amount about, and which manifests in Appalachia with the Scots-Irish as the most obvious example. My great-grandpa was in the Jersey City police force, and he picked the wrong faction in the local Democrat Party politics. He was the last man to stand by his patron when everyone else had fled him. He killed his entire reputation and career in the city due to his loyalty to his patron. My grandpa, Joseph Lynch, grew up in Jersey City and worked as a longshoreman. He was 18 years old in 1942 when he was drafted to fight. He passed an IQ test with no background in mathematics and was sent as an aide to the British, he said, because they wanted to make Americans look better to the British by having a humanities-based guy who could talk about philosophy and stuff. And my grandpa always underplayed stuff. He might have been doing more stuff. I don't know. And for those that don't know, the Enigma code was how the British hacked into the German code system in World War II. Some historians think that that turned the tide of the war, and my grandpa was part of that program. We don't really know what he was doing, though. And he didn't talk about it for 30 years until after the event was over, when he was just watching the TV, and the Enigma team came up, and he said to my family, "Oh, yeah, I worked there." After the war, he went back to America, and he was able to go to Harvard on the GI Bill. And he tried to be a lawyer after that, but then they forced him to take too many cases that were against his honor, and so he quit to become a professor. However, during his career as a lawyer, he befriended a Russian noblewoman who became quite fond of him, and so when she died, she left him her inheritance. And when he was a professor, he studied constitutional law, teaching at a school in northern New Jersey up by New York. And the book he wrote in constitutional law was that the founding fathers had purposely structured the Constitution so that there was a degree of plausible deniability inside the philosophic logic, so that you could have a sub-variety of different possible positions with each law that was written. He married my grandmother, Irene O'Neill, where they met at the St. Patrick's Day dance. And she worked she was a homemaker for the family, and he had 5 children where he moved to Princeton, New Jersey to support his family. He did a lot to try to assimilate out of the Irish community. So he studied classical literature, and he studied culture and the Renaissance, and he was really into medieval theology. And he became very Catholic due to the war, where he believed that the war was symbolic for the dangers of modernism and totalitarianism, and the only way we could break out of that was through a return to Christianity. So he was a very strong fundamentalist Catholic, and he thought the 1930s Catholic Church, which meant most people saw as ridiculous reactionary, he thought that it was too liberal, and they had to return to medieval values. He was also, although he didn't teach at Princeton, he lived in Princeton, and so he was friends with a lot of the professors, and he was friends with multiple of the most important Catholic philosophers of that time period. And he supported my family off a middle-class income. They lived in a small house together, and they had, I don't know if I said he had 5 kids before, but that's crazy. The Irish used to have that many kids. And, oh yeah, so Irene O'Neill, she's a descendant of Niall of the Nine Hostages, who was a Irish warlord in the 2nd century AD, and he has 6 million descendants because he slept with that many women, and that was a common occurrence for Irish chieftains. It's why, like, all of these last names have millions of descendants, where that's true for multiple Irish leaders. Alastair of the Isles in Scotland's an easy example. Niall of the Nine Hostages. I'm sure Cuchulainn is from O'Connor is from the Irish Hercules, Cuchulainn. Irish last names are nearly 2,000 years old, which is pretty cool. And my family were fishermen in the 1800s before we moved over. And so I wonder if Irish last names are that old, because Gaelic, O'Loinch, in Gaelic, the last name Lynch is from O'Loinchug, which is son of a fisherman. So were my ancestors fishermen for 2,000 years? Final hilarious story about my grandpa. So my grandpa died about 10 years ago, and he was like 95. It's crazy. He was born 1926. And for the final year he was at the home, or the retirement home, whenever he saw an actress on the TV, he yelled whore, because he said, quote, all of these actresses have sold their bodies to get their status. And he said, I won't stand for this. So this leads, final thing. My grandpa fought against the university system. He picked 2 impossible battles, which is classic Lynch move. I can't say Lynch move. But he picked the fight with modernity because he thought it was all satanic. And he also picked a fight with the university because when he was a professor, he was the only conservative for over a decade. And it's crazy to see he went from voting for FDR to voting for Trump. And my mom, and my mom's not an objective source, said that when he retired, the leftist faculty threw a party because they got rid of the last conservative. Next comes Peter Lynch, unrelated to the famous investor Peter Lynch, who is my uncle, who worked as a strategist for the New Jersey police for nearly 40 years. He said in the 1980s that the greatest new threats to New Jersey were Latin American, especially Salvadorian, and black gangs. This killed his career for the rest of over 30 years because he said the politically incorrect answer, and New Jersey's pretty corrupt, where they only targeted the Italian mafia, and you weren't allowed to say something besides that. And so he became incredibly nihilistic and dissatisfied. He always talks about the Masons running everything. Very sharp guy, though. He's really into Korean dragon boat racing and Morocco and Korea and foreign cultures. Next comes my dad, Mark Lynch, who was born in 1961, and he went to Harvard like my grandpa as a young man. He ran the Harvard Strategy Club as his hobby. After that, he started working in Wall Street when the Reagan presidency started, where he met my mom. My dad made solid money as a mutual fund manager and banking expert. He's an expert in regional and international banking. My father has the same obsessive nerd spirit as what I have, where he's read over 300 books on banking history. He may be the person in the world who's read the most banking history. I try to get him to write a history of banking, and he doesn't do it. And he runs a Mad Max fan account and banking advice page called Corpus Colossus on Twitter. Some of my friends followed my dad without even them realizing it. And he has the ability to look at the outside of a bank, like its driveway or its building structure, and then assess the strategic model the bank uses from that and its core strengths and weaknesses versus other banks. You can give him any city in America, and he will know the top 20 banks in each of their history. I had a joke with my friends growing up where we'd walk past a certain 100-year-old bank, and I'd text my dad, and he'd tell me their entire history. And he studied the banking system of every major country as his hobby. He also has a hobby in studying Marxist literature, where he's read over 200 books on the topic since his college thesis was on the Left Book Club, which was a leftist printing company for political content in 1930s Britain. And he's read 200 books on the topic. And so growing up, he would explain Marxist lies to me, in that he would read these books to me, and then he would go through how the Marxists had lied, the methods they have used for deception, like overemphasizing numbers, not looking at practical application or human nature. So I heard that stuff growing up. And he said he studied leftist philosophy because he wanted to know how someone could have completely incorrect beliefs and yet be so sure of themselves. And my dad's also predicted every major financial crisis of the last 40 years. And he would tell me as a child, you know, Rudyard, due to money printing, this country's not going to be in a good place around when you're college aged. We'll have blown out our entire economic system. I hope it's better once you're out of college, though. And my family were in the nice house and nice vacation cast of rich, not in the private helicopter and complex trust fund category of rich. I think my family's net worth when I was a kid was like $10 to $15 million total. And my dad, I'm sorry, I love you, Dad, but you have very strong Asperger's, which you might have picked up on. And my dad studies 19th century train routes as a hobby. He memorizes them, and he has an incredibly encyclopedic knowledge of human history, amongst many other things. And when I was a kid, I would just barrage my dad with infinite questions. I'd ask my dad 1,000 questions a day. I would ask him questions on I'd ask him questions on how he made decisions. I'd ask him questions of the world. It was nice having my dad around because I could just feed off his information. I downloaded so much of it, and it's so much of my worldview. And my dad told me growing up that the only thing that matters in life is honor. And he said, I don't care if you're poor. I don't care what you do with your life as long as you have honor. And that was a value we kept hammering home all the time, that the only thing you could truly own as a man is your own honor. And an example of the kind of guy my dad is that I once texted him, I am going to Mexico tomorrow for a week. And his reply was cool in lowercase. When I was 16, my dad said, you are a man now. I had two roles as a father, to teach you to be a man and to teach you have honor. I have succeeded at both. You are now a man. You are now responsible for your own actions. Figure your own stuff out. And he once said he bought me my first car, and he said, I will buy you the cheapest car you can fit into, which was a Subaru. And he said, now, the things you do out there are your responsibility, not mine. And, another example of the kind of guy my dad is that he ate tuna fish every single day of his life from ages 12 to ages 30. And he did it because it was 50 cents cheaper than the other sandwich option. And he was just accruing the financial benefits of 50 cents a day. And then it gave him crippling mercury poisoning. And my father had crippling mercury poisoning when he inseminated me, which nearly killed him. And nothing worked, and he worked with Russian alternative healers who lowered his mercury blood pressure. And then he went on a trip to China for business, and then jacked up the mercury again. And then he suffered for like over a decade with very painful mercury poisoning. He also had gout, which was very unpleasant. I remember his suffering. He couldn't eat beef or wine for years. He was just on like a purely vegetarian diet, which is sad. And yeah, the mercury poisoning was crippling pain. And I can't overstate how instrumental my dad is to who I am as a person. My dad's very wise and said a lot of things that stuck with me for my entire life. For example, let your thought and action be one. The second you think, act. When I was scared about failing a test in high school, my dad took me to the local creek outside our house, and he said, look at this creek flow, Rudyard. This creek was here long before the white man came, and it was probably here before the natives were there before, or before the earlier group of natives had replaced another group of natives. And he said, this creek will keep flowing whether or not you fail the test. You should know that so many of your worries are in your head, and you go out into nature and they're not there anymore. He told me that the way to get rich was to acquire useful skills, and then once you have enough useful skills, someone will pay you for a skill. And he said that there are certain hills you have to die on to be a man. And he said that when everything's said and done, the only thing that matters is that you stood where you needed to stand. And he read to me and my sister before bed every single night for a decade. He read us all of Lord of the Rings, all of Narnia, some of Louis L'Amour, the autobiography of Lee Kuan Yew, Niall's Saga, and Dune, among like a dozen other books. He got me 20 of the great courses or college-level courses and played them in the car when I was a child so I could get an education with him. Then we would talk about those topics together. And my dad had a rule that I could only play strategy games until I was age 15. He said that he wanted to innately wire my neurology in a way so that I could think strategically on a basal level. He told me that this would do me more good in life than school would. Although my family was wealthy, my dad didn't spend money on me. He forced me to work for stuff. When I was 16, I was already driving my own car, making my own money, running errands, and washing my clothes. He would leave me at home for weeks when he was on business trips for work and expected me to take care of the house, do affairs in his name when I was a teenager. At the company my dad worked at, he was one of the last people who ran a department that wasn't woke. The company was being stultified by bureaucracy, and when he retired, the company fell into a DEI bureaucracy that killed it. When my dad left, they said, "We need you, Mark," to which his reply is, "If I did it, you can do it." And as a child, my father would repeatedly tell me, "You will not inherit a cent until I die," because he said, "You have my blood in your veins, and so you can figure out a way to make some money." And he said, "You throw someone in the pool, they're not going to drown, they're going to swim." And I once asked him for new shoes as a teenager, and he just stood there and said, "No." And my old pair, I'd worn them for like a year. They were pretty beat up. And he said that he did all this effort because I was representative of my entire bloodline and that my actions represented the honor of my people, my self, and my ancestors. And thus I had to reflect that responsibility in my actions. And that was a theme all of my family had. Both of my parents were into the ancestor stuff and the honor stuff. My father's become kind of a hermit where he lives in the woods in Pennsylvania and avoids society because he thinks the public is stupid. And that's kind of his lifestyle. Like, I didn't really have any connections growing up because my dad lives as a hermit. And he has a girlfriend, though. And he's a prepper. He has over a month of food and water at any given time in case stuff goes bad. I once asked my father, because he's Catholic, "How does it feel to be a papist?" And he replied, "Let me consult with the Pope before I answer." And when my dad has gone to Republican Party events, he wears a tie with rhinos on it to show that he is spiritually a rhino. Now we get to my mom's side of the family. My mom was born in Kitchener-Waterloo, Ontario, to parents from Nebraska. This made her a Canadian citizen, which is an important plot point later. Her ancestry is mostly English, stemming from the third Albion seed migration the Quakers did from northwestern England to Pennsylvania and the Middle States. In a prime example of anthropology in action, I grew up in Chester County, while according to 23andMe, my ancestors are from Chester, England. Her ancestry has been in America since the 1600s, where I have ancestors on the Mayflower, as well as ancestors stretching from upstate New York down to North Carolina, kind of concentrated in the middle states. And my ancestry is 90% British Isles, with something like 80% being just English and Irish. The final 20% is a mix of basically different Protestant ethnicities between Scots-Irish, Scottish, Welsh, Dutch, German, Swedish, Finnish, etc. And I'm 10% German ancestry, mostly from Baden-Württemberg in southwest Germany, which was an area that got 3/4 of its population wiped out in the 30 Years' War, and so they fled to America and the Volga River in Russia to escape because they were Protestants being persecuted by Catholics. And my mom was also obsessed with honor. She would say that the only thing that mattered in life was pride and class growing up, which was her WASP way of framing it. My mom's ancestry always followed the frontier. They started out in the East Coast in the colonial period and ended up in Nebraska by the mid 19th century. I know of at least 5 ancestors who died in the Indian Wars, with casualties spreading from a young girl whose family was killed in upstate New York, and then she was captured by the natives, and then she left the natives, married a white guy, then a guy who was killed by a black native mix in Oklahoma in a failed trade deal, a guy with the drafter, he was an ambassador to, I believe, the Chickasaw Nation. They killed him, etc. A lot of ancestors died in the Indian Wars. And I have lots of distant relatives like Sir William Marshall, apparently William the Conqueror, Mad Anthony Wayne, or one of the drafters of the Texas Constitution. And the furthest ancestor I can possibly reach out, and I don't really have noble ancestors. My ancestors are all peasants. But I have some bastard ancestors, like a bastard nobleman who was rebelling against the Jacobites and sent to South Carolina, where he married a native woman. I alternate between having 0.1%. Apparently it's South Pacific Islander ancestry, according to 23andMe, but their data sets are screwed up in a way that certain genetic subcomponents of Native Americans process as Pacific Islander for them, for complex reasons, because Native Americans, they don't do genetics tests, so our data set for them is pretty small. But I am 100% Northwestern European now. There was an earlier point when my mom and my sister had 0.1% South Pacific Islander ancestry. And I'm also, I forgot what I was going to say there. There's another relative I'm forgetting. But the established pattern in my family was that they'd move to a new frontier, form a new business, said business would do well for a generation, then the next generation would fail, the business dies, they move to a new frontier to restart. My family did this with arms manufacturing, fur trading, cotton, oil, and a variety of other industries. Each time the next generation would trash the wealth and restart on a new frontier. My grandfather grew up in one of the wealthiest families in Nebraska who ran an insurance company. He refused to take up the family business and instead decided to be a hippie as a young man. My mother is intensely resentful about this because she grew up in poverty, and so she could have said, you know, if my father didn't drop the business, I could be a senator for Nebraska now. And there's an interesting detail here that my great-grandma was kind of a hoe, and that she was sleeping with 2 men in 1942 Nebraska. One was half Norwegian, half German, and the other was English. She married the first guy, and here I am with my 90% British Isles ancestry. Mr. Zimmer was tricked and realized he had been cucked and changed and took out his resentment on his son. That's a big reason why my grandpa left the family business, because he felt he didn't deserve it because he wasn't the real son. And he left and met my grandmother at Unitarian Church because they were both rebelling against their Presbyterian parents in Lincoln, Nebraska. And they got married. My grandmother went to Swarthmore and then dropped out because she loved my grandfather to be a homemaker with him. My grandfather had a background in computer mathematics, but he lacked the personal ability to hold a job. So my mother, her brother, and my grandfather traveled around the world as he tried to hold a job. My mom partly grew up in Nebraska, Massachusetts, Iran, Maryland, North Carolina, Ontario, Alberta, amongst others. My mom grew up in poverty and constant chaos. My grandmother divorced my grandfather when my mom was around age 7, which is the age she divorced my father. And my grandmother is very left-wing. A funny story here is that when my mother told my grandmother that she was going to marry a Irish Catholic Republican, my grandmother said, who's very left-wing, she said, "Oh, are you sure he'll want to have children? They're not like us, And she also thinks that we should forcibly deindustrialize. So she thinks that they shouldn't have air conditioning in Texas for climate reasons, which is deranged. That's not going to work here. So she's very left-wing, and I once saw her reading a Afro-Indigenous history of America, and I joked, is there a biography for all 5 of them? And my mother was valedictorian of her high school that she finished in Worcester, Massachusetts, and Then she went to Columbia University where she got a political science degree. She then worked on Wall Street where she met my father. And they started dating when my mom moved back to Boston, and then my father would commute to Boston and then finally moved there as they dated and eventually married. My mom has a wide variety of interests and is incredibly intelligent between anthropology, religion, philosophy, chemistry, political science, mythology, religion. I think I said those already, etc. And she was instrumental in establishing my worldview in as profound a way as my father. My mother told me growing up that the moral values of the society would get more constrictive, so much so to a level that you would be unable to breathe in a society filled with so many social rules. And they said, Rudyard, you either have the choice of working with this system or breaking out of it and doing your own thing. And you can only really pick the second choice. My mom also ran a brewery, which was her hobby, where she would make moonshine in our garage, and she made really good beer. My mother was convinced that she was a psychic capable of communing with spirits. She would constantly tell me as a child what the different spirits were telling her. She said she spoke to God and the devil and Mother Nature, and she'd said that the native spirits were not happy that the whites did not honor them after we conquered them, and this is why our society is so obsessed with land conquest, because in normal society you would give the spirits an offering, but we haven't given them offerings. I don't know. I just hear this stuff. And she believed that politeness was incredibly important. And she kept on teaching me manners and class and politeness and self-respect because she said they'd end up becoming decisive to my life. My parents met and got married living in Boston together. They had my sister Valentine in 1999, and I was born in 2001. My parents were originally going to name me Noel, but when I was born, they said they could sense that I would grow up to be a writer. So they named me after the century-old poet Rudyard Kipling. So I'm Rudyard Lynch. And interestingly, Rudyard is a specific name to the sub-region of England my mom's family are from. There were a lot of Rudyards in the colonization of Pennsylvania, and it was a Quaker name. And Rudyard Kipling was the author of Kim and the play If. And he was a big champion for the British Empire, and he was very much into heroism and honor and the things that I talk about. And they said that I just had too much energy to be named Noel, because Noel's more of a bookish name. And everyone in my family, I'm going to throw this detail in because I have to throw it in somewhere to brag. Everyone in my family is over 6 foot, or at least my mom and my sister are 5'11", my dad's 6'2", I'm 6'4". So for my sister as well, let me talk about her a little. She is a little bit younger than me, or sorry, she's a little bit 2 years older than me. And she was really creative when I was a kid. She was really into fantasy novels. She wrote multiple fantasy novels as her hobby. She knits for her hobby. She's made like dozens of sweaters, and she's really into Star Trek, and she loves her dog so much. But she's a Maoist. She thinks the government should forcibly deindustrialize the economy, and I'm going to jump ahead in my life because it doesn't fit with the narrative otherwise. She followed a lot of my mom's advice, so she moved up to Canada when I was a teenager. She went to a leftist university in Canada. She went to University of Toronto, one of the best colleges in Canada, and she left it believing that we had to forcibly deindustrialize the economy, and she believes it's immoral to have children, and she believes it's immoral to pass on her own culture, and so she's going to adopt a black baby. She's going to adopt a minority rather than having one of her own babies. And she's a lesbian now. She's also I said she was into environmentalism earlier with, that was the degree she got. And that's kind of where that in high school is where she became super left-wing. As I said before, I was born in Manchester by the Sea, which is this weird beach town in northern Massachusetts up by New Hampshire. And there was a movie that was made a few years ago with Casey Affleck about that town. And my mom forced me to be born with a midwife around 4 a.m. since she believed hospitals killed the spirit of a child through how they birthed children. And she also forced me to get no vaccines as a kid since she believed they were dangerous to spiritual development. My mom was really against the COVID vaccine. She cut out my sister during COVID because my sister took the vaccine. I have very few memories of Massachusetts. One of two, one is them seeing a relative, my uncle. The other one is there was a huge snowstorm, and I was a toddler. I was 3. I couldn't walk through the snowstorm, and I remember just seeing snow everywhere. I'd make little prints in the snow with my boots. And we were the only outsiders in that town that had moved in for decades, and thus the zoning board was able to kick us out of the town. The entire town was old money Yankees whose families had been there for centuries, and we were the first nouveau riche to move there. They were not financially in a good place because they were living off really old money, and there was a degree of resentment. And they made up rumors my dad was making his money off drug trafficking, and my mom was a horse and dog lady, and they made it basically illegal to have both animals in town. We were completely socially outcasted and forced to leave. The company my dad worked at had dual offices in Boston and Philly. When I was 4, my dad made the decision to move our family to Philadelphia. He made this call since he was from across the river to Pennsylvania in New Jersey, so he knew the culture there. I often think about this for a couple reasons. Firstly, with the zoning board in Massachusetts, you would hope something that petty and tribal wouldn't happen today in an advanced first world, one of the most advanced states in a first world country, but it does. Secondarily, it's interesting that it became such a pivotal part of my life. Being a Pennsylvanian is such a big part of my identity that wouldn't be there if I grew up in northern Massachusetts. And finally, it's really interesting anthropologically because both my dad and my mom, Nebraska and New Jersey, are part of the Midland cultural group anthropologists talk about. And so when they were up in the Yankee population group, the town forced them out, and they defaulted back onto moving to a region where they were culturally and genetically closer to the population. It's another example of anthropology in action. And my parents, I think, are pretty objectively part of America's ruling class, but they kind of degenerated into rednecks and refused to take it. We always lived at least 20 to 30 minutes from the nearest grocery store, nearly 40 minutes from shopping, and an hour from the city. I always lived next to cows, cornfields, and woods. I remember seeing a drought one year which broke all the land and crackled it up. And interestingly, that drought is part of the cause for the Arab Spring because grain prices went up as the Midwest got drier. And then that very winter, there was an 11-foot snow drift where there was snow dunes up to 11 feet tall. And my mom would literally make moonshine in the garage. In a job interview for my mom's brewery, a guy literally skinned a deer during the job interview in front of us. My dad and I would go duck hunting together. I didn't really associate with other wealthy people, with my entire network being middle-class people from the schools I went to, and my parents don't really have connections. I always hoped that being a banker's son from rural PA would get me further, but on the national scale, it doesn't matter at all. It's completely irrelevant. And my parents lived by themselves in the woods. And growing up, the thing I thought about the most was the forest. It's just trees everywhere in every direction. And that always got to me. And I'd spend hours playing in the forest. And I was shocked that it went on forever. And it was so beautiful with all the animals and the grass and the creeks and stuff. That area of the country is super beautiful. It looks a lot like the Shire and this English rural ideal, but it's more wooded. And I just thought the world was an empty place growing up because we didn't even go to Philly that much. And so I just remember seeing infinite trees. Both of my parents nearly died before I turned 6. My dad was from mercury poisoning. We spoke about that before. And my mom was kicked in the head by a horse. And I just assumed my mom was dead for the next 2 days. And she was brain dead, and I still remember the air siren going off as the ambulance came to get my mom. My sister, Valentine, and I were hiding under the kitchen aisle when the policeman said, "Hey, kids." And my sister and I would joke about that for years. That's such a short thing to say to kids who just thought their mom died. My mom, after she nearly died, said that she had visited God. She said that God had forced her to come back to help people. This resulted in her immediately divorcing my father. My mom wanted us to all sleep in the same bed as a family, and my dad refused. I ran out of the bed, and then my dad spanked me. My mom then took my sister and me out of school and took me away from my dad's custody. My parents put me in this French language school in Philadelphia for stupid reasons I still don't understand. My dad was terrified of my mom divorcing him, and so he was leading her on that we could move to France as a family, which was never actually an option, and so I was held hostage in this French language situation. And I was very resentful because I was forced to learn classes in a language I did not know, that no one explained to me. So I had to learn French on the fly. And I was so resentful because the commute was 1 hour each way. We were going from rural Pennsylvania to Philly for my school commute. So when I was 5 and 6, I was commuting 2 hours a day. And I would count every single day until I was out of school, and I had a tick because I saw school as slavery. And I watched the Ben-Hur scene as a child, and I empathized with the galley slaves, where I felt like I was like them. After my mom took my sister, she took my sister and me. She claimed that my dad was an alcoholic who was beating her and my sister and me. There's literally no evidence for this at all, and my father physically couldn't even drink at the time due to him having gout. And the worst he ever did was he spanked me twice. However, my mom is a literal schizophrenic that has different internal monologues which conflict with the other. She had no evidence at all for the claim and is mentally ill. She passed the Chester County test for not being mentally ill. And if my mom doesn't score mentally ill on a test, your test's broken. And on top of that, my mom really spiraled with getting kicked in the head by a horse. She had issues beforehand, and then it became magnified. And her entire life since that has been a downward spiral towards greater and greater madness as she loses touch with the world. And my mom played the courts incredibly intelligently. It was basically an incentive structure thing where with the criticism, they were incentivized to accept the criticism because if there was any chance my dad was beating my mom and me, their career was over. So they sided with my mom out of their own basal self-interest. And the court gave my mom full custody of me and my sister for years, and my dad was only able to see us a few hours in guided visitation. And my mom took 2/3 of my dad's money. I would like to restate, my father did literally nothing wrong here by all accounts. He's an admirable man as a citizen and as an adult. I sided with my dad against my mom, and my sister sided with my mom, but it didn't matter. The court system sided with my mom. My mom said that God had told her the best way she could help human history was by torturing me. She said she did this since she loved me, and God told her that the more she tortured me, the more vastly disproportionate the impact on human history would be in a positive way. My mom abused me in ways I can't even put into words. I left my childhood feeling completely numb and just dead. My mom believed she would have an enormous breakthrough in the field of agriculture, in which modern agriculture was destroying the innate living biosphere, and she believed that by torturing me, she brought this fate closer. My mom started out as a sort of socialist and communist who believed that there was going to be a revolution against the rich. And then she went through a Wicca phase, a Christian fundamentalist phase, and by the time I graduated high school, she was a far-right borderline fascist. She wanted America to be a WASP ethno-state where she believed the Jews, the banks, and the Catholics were destroying America. My life was a complete nightmare. My mom moved me and my sister 13 times before I turned age 15. And I was never able to get any stability. I started to see my life as trench warfare. Whenever I had a free moment, I would dig myself in for the next barrage. My family had money, but my mom was so financially irresponsible that she would constantly sue my father for more money before spending it on stupid stuff. My mom, my sister, and I lived in a one-room log cabin for 6 months while my mom tried to get more money. My mom would make moonshine and ran a brewery as her job in the garage. My father did something quite heroic here. He realized that my mom was crazy, and he spent 6 years fighting my mom in court for custody of me. He realized that if he didn't do this, his children would just be lost forever. The sanity, safety, and stability my father provided me is the thing that kept me alive. I would 100% have killed myself if he wasn't there. And he was finally able to get 1/3 custody of me and my sister. The Chester County court system gave the nickname that the Lynch family were the people who would never surrender an inch on anything. My parents literally threatened to sue each other over half-an-hour time frames of custody and single days of determining what custody I got would become hostage negotiations for me. My parents viewed every concession they would give the other as an insult to their own honor that they had to fight to the death over. I learned to shut up since the courts clearly didn't care about anything I was saying, and I knew what game they were playing, in that I knew they were trying to get evidence to support my mom because it was the easier choice. And I dealt with like about half a dozen different social workers in order to assess custody, and none of them knew what was happening. And for multiple of the social workers, I just realized the game and I refused to speak. There was a guy called D'Amico who was a social worker who I declared war on him, and I just stared at the clock for the entire hour session because he was trying to pull concessions out of me to make a story that my dad was the bad guy. At least that's what I remember. I once told the judge, "Are you deaf?" Since past a certain point, I knew nothing I said mattered. I was an insanely aggressive kid. I literally would play strategy games for 4 hours a day. They became my entire life, and I'd play games like Age of Mythology, Age of Empires, Civilization, Total War, or Battle for Middle-earth, just to name a few. Stronghold Legends is great too. And my mom had a rule that I could only play video games for 1 hour a day, but I broke that because my commute was 2 hours, so I played video games in those 2 hours, and my dad would subsidize and buy video games for me and let me play them as much as possible. And I think playing that many video games when I was in a traumatic experience was so good for me, in that it wired my brain in a lot of useful ways we'll see later in this video. And I remember a moment when a teacher said, if as a class we spent 1 hour a week doing math practice in 3rd grade, we could get an ice cream party at the end of the year. I told her no, since that doesn't add up, because dozens of hours of effort does not equal an ice cream lunch. It's just not a correct calculation. And she kept bullying me to do this until she gave up and let me go to the ice cream party anyway. And every single day I was in that French language school, I would count the hours until the day end. I told my parents multiple times a week how much I hated that school, and they only took me out after 4 years to put me in public school, finally. I had to interject this point in later, but a story I want to remember is when I was in 5th grade, or around age 10, my friends and I played a board game at the end of the school year, that being Axis and Allies, and I remembered the exact placement for troops years later for each faction. 5 years later, I remembered what territory each faction held and how strategically. And that started to weird me out that I had very good memory. And my dad would play a game where he would play a song twice for me and then have me repeat back the lyrics. And he was astonished that I could do it. I actually really enjoyed going to public school. This was in a rural area around Hawkinson, or on the Mason-Dixon line where Pennsylvania, Delaware, and Maryland meet up. And my mom moved there from the area around Malvern, and my dad continued to live further north of there. And it's one of those beautiful places I've ever seen in the world, where, as I said before, it looks like the Shire. It's just rolling fields and countryside. And Winslow Homer was a famous painter who used Chad's Ford, where I grew up, as the set for his landscape paintings. Everyone was really nice to me, and I made a lot of friends. I even got along with the teachers, which I thought was impossible because I was so combative. When I was in 4th grade, one of the teachers saw a map I made and she said, "Rudyard, you're going to be famous when you grow up." And the culture of the area I grew up in, Chester County at the time, was called God, Guns, and Horses. And over time, it became more left-wing, and it got pacified. And the way to see the Northeast is that in Pennsylvania is you got a series of different subcultures. So the way the greater Philly area goes is you have Midwestern Protestants, Catholic Northeasterners, and Black Southerners. And where I grew up felt like a cultural extension of the Midwest. It felt like it could be completely Ohio, where when I was in middle school, our curriculum in history is how the American Revolution was amazing. Then all our history teachers were members of the NRA and they owned guns. Our Boy Scouts leaders were former Vietnam vets. It's very much that kind of culture. You know, in a lot of Pennsylvania, in rural Pennsylvania, they give the first day of the deer hunting season as a day off from school and from work. Hunting's a big part of the culture there. And to change topic to something less pleasant, my mom started to spiral into bizarre conspiracy theories that my father had bands of thugs who were vandalizing her property. And she literally had no evidence for this. And the Chester County court system got so fed up with her bullshit that they literally refused to take cases from my family, forcing them to go to external counseling to solve our own issues. Chester County cycles through judges, and my mom accused each of the different judges and any social worker who stood against her of corruption charges. And the third judge built up a personal vendetta against my mom and demanded that every future case that involved her go through her. This judge saved me so much suffering, and I literally emailed her to thank her as an adult. My mom shot one of her horses to frame my father for killing it. My mom would also keep 5 cats from one of her friends in a tiny closet that barely had air. This is a weird tangent, but my mom was also obsessed with the FBI stalking her. I have suspicions my mom was involved in the secret government testing program MKUltra, given they sourced from places like Columbia Political Science Department at that very moment, as far as I've researched. My mom was super cynical about the ruling class before that was a big thing. She believed she was a psychic, which is another MKUltra thing. She was paranoid about the FBI following her, and I also know that she was molested. That's too many points for my own comfort, and I'm scared to even say stuff like this on this video, but this video is going to get so much crazy. That's not even in the top 10. My mom hired security guards against this imaginary threat, but then those bankrupted her, so she moved my sister and me against my father's consent to downtown Philly. This really disappointed me since I loved living in Chester County so much. I went to a Quaker school in Philly, and I was raised a Quaker because my mom has lots of Quaker ancestors, and my dad thought I should be raised Protestant. And Quakers are really big in that region of Pennsylvania because they founded it. And I attended 2 Quaker services a week for years straight. I've attended Quaker services for most of my life. And people have said to me that Quakerism has had an enormous impact on how I see the world. And that makes sense to me. My mom was a horse lady, and she also taught me how to ride. I was a pretty good horseman as a kid, and my mom said it's important because horseback riding teaches you leadership, because most leadership is implicit through body language and how you carry yourself, which is how horses communicate. And she said, quote, "Deal with a horse as you would deal with a woman or a crowd. They are emotional prey animals." The move to Philadelphia was one of the most instrumental turning points of my life. My father still lived out in the exurbs, and so I would commute between both. I moved from a completely car-dependent society to one that was one of the most walkable places in America. Philly has such a warm place in my heart, and it has a bad reputation for obvious reasons, given it's the poorest and most crime-filled of America's top 10 largest cities, but it has wonderful culture, architecture, it's affordable, historic, and walkable. I'm a walker by nature, And I would walk across downtown Philly from Camden to UPenn as a way to clear my head. Because for me, walking and thinking are the same process. And this was a really important period of my life since around age 13, I gained self-awareness about who I was as a person, where beforehand it was like I was on autopilot more so. And I had several really important breakthroughs around the time of age 13. One was that I hadn't really ever read a book until I was age 12. And then I looked at a book my dad owned, and I realized, wait, if I'm physically capable of reading a single page of this book, that means, because it's a repeated task, I could read 1,000 pages easily. Because if I can read a single page, I can do the task on repeat since I know how to do it. And that was The Book of Swords by Fred Saberhagen. And I have, starting at age 14, read 70 to 80,000 pages a year and around 80 books a year. And I've maintained that consistently for over a decade. And there has nearly never been a day where I have not read in the last decade. And by the time I started high school, I could draw every country and every year of human history off the top of my head. I would have events at my school where people would yell countries at me on a whiteboard, and I'd draw them and I'd see how many I could draw in 2 minutes. And I started this channel on my 13th birthday, where I stopped playing video games when I became a teenager, and I got into alternate history as my hobby. And I would spend a lot of time on alternate history forums, where I just didn't think they were that good, if I'm honest. The alternate history community is kind of amateur because it's probably lots of people like me who are in a certain developmental stage of their lives. And so I thought I could make better alternate histories. I had nothing better to do. I hated school. And so I tried to make a alternate history wiki account, and that was too difficult with the account process they have. So I started making a alternate history YouTube channel, and I was really inspired by the book series Time Riders, which is a young adult sci-fi alternate history series. And Cody from Alternate History Hub was my biggest inspiration, and I wanted to make a channel like Alternate History Hub as a teenager. And for the first 7 years, I made alternate history content. You can scroll through the old channel. It's stuff like, what if the South won the Civil War? What if the dinosaurs never went extinct? And keep in mind, for the first 5 years of my channel, I had less than 500 subscribers total. I literally bought the microphone I used for the channel with money I made from the channel 5 years in. You can tell that because the mic quality sucked. It was a meme for commenters on my channel for the longest time. And I was obsessed with this. I would literally work on Christmas to avoid my family and just making content for the channel. And I read 40 books in alternate history when I was a teenager because I was bored and it was my thing. And I think people have commented upon alternate history's effect on my current philosophic views because alternate history assesses the world in a probabilistic manner based on causation. And that's instrumental in my worldview. I think alternate history, my dad's background in banking analysis, and strategy video games are 3 really important influences in how I think, which look at basically causation and strategic decision making. When I moved from Chester County to Philly, I moved from a majority conservative area to a very left-wing area. I went from a society that seems pretty close to John Hughes or The Simpsons' stereotypical America from decades ago, which I just assumed was how America was. In Philly, our elite are WASPs, and so I assumed that that was the ruling class structure across America, and that America was still the way it was in the 20th century. And I was so shocked to see the World Economic Forum types because I just didn't think they existed. It was a crazy wake-up call when I became an adult traveling around the country how backwards Philly is compared to other places. And I jumped from a 3 out of 10 wokeness to an 8 out of 10 wokeness. The small private Christian high school I went to had become what was by all accounts a leftist seminary. I hated that ideology ever since I first saw it. Teachers would openly say in class that there were too many white men in science and academia, and I was forced to go through what amounts to constant humiliation rituals in school as a white male. I read 1984 as a teenager and knew that the ideology I saw in school was the exact same ideology as that dominated 1984. I was a centrist until I was in college, but I started watching Sargon of Akkad, who was moving me rightward and who introduced me to conservatism. I vowed to fight back against an ideology that would push this. I just wanted revenge against the left, if I'm honest. Things got pretty bad in high school. The year after I graduated, they turned the entire humanities curriculum into leftist-based. This included race and science in the Roman Empire, as well as not talking about the French or industrial revolutions in the history curriculum or the world wars, to spend more time talking about slavery. We had a mandatory social justice week to celebrate social justice causes where my school flew in a speaker from New Mexico to say that using violence to push social justice was justified. It was basically impossible to not be a leftist. For example, we were allowed to skip class to go to an anti-gun protest. I was the only person in my class who didn't, and when people asked me why, I said it felt like an emotionally charged topic. And my school, for example, had a 3-year history award. I never won the history award, I suspect because I wasn't left-wing. I barely passed school in both middle school and the start of high school. There were moments I was convinced I would fail school. I literally went to school for something like over 12 hours a day because class was 8 hours. Then my school had a mandatory sports program, which was 2.5 hours for a third of the year. I basically hacked the system by doing lighting and stage production for my school's plays. And then you have 2 to 3 hours of homework a night. That's like a Chinese work schedule. And I'm so deeply resentful of being forced to do this for my youth. I could have been doing fun stuff, but you forced me to do classes and you forced me to do work that had zero application for the rest of my life. And at the end of middle school, I couldn't see the whiteboard since my eyes were too poor. My mom refused to get me glasses for over a year since she said I didn't need them. And when my parents finally got me glasses, grades improved. By the way, I'm just here to air out grievances at this point. When I went to public school, my public school was a 40-minute drive from where I lived. And so school started at 7:20, the bus came at 6:40, and I woke up at 5:30. This is when I was friggin' like 12 years old. And I'm very resentful of this because I'm an innately nocturnal person. I go to sleep at 2 to 3 a.m. right now. And when I went to elementary school, the school was an hour away. And so my sister's school started earlier because she went to middle school when I went to elementary school. And so I would sit in the school parking lot for an hour playing video games until the school started. And I'm still very resentful about having to wake up early. There was zero reason you had to do this. You could have started school at 10 a.m. Nothing would have changed. I don't care about your sports program. It doesn't matter. And one of the things my high school did really well was it hired eccentric teachers, which let students be creative. When I was in high school, I made an independent study where I wrote a 250-page screenplay about the fall of Rome that followed 4 families around the Battle of Adrianople. I was in computer science class with a teacher who was a video game designer, and we had to make video games in computer science class. I told my teacher, who's a cool guy, he's made a great video game called Jamestown, about Martians, space warfare 200 years from now based off 17th century England. I said I wanted to make a strategy game based off 17th century Poland, Lithuania. He told me I wasn't physically capable of doing that, and I took that as an insult to my honor, so I spent 4 hours for weeks coding the game with different unit types, battle factions, strategies, and that sort of thing. My religion teacher and I became quite close. My school had a theology program that was actually quite useful for me. I learned a lot of really important theology there. And they had a Mennonite teacher who, when he retired, was replaced by a black Muslim, former Black Panther. But he was an awesome dude. He went to Harvard, and he converted to both Islam and Christianity at different times. And he gave me a lot of spiritual guidance as a teenager. We would hang out for years after school, and he studied philosophy, and he was okay with me being a conservative. And he said that I was actually going to found a religion when I was in high school, and that was what I'd be good at. And I also ran a fight club in the basement of my high school where we'd whack each other with rubber weapons, and then we would basically bet on who would win with no money. It was a lot of fun. And most of the people from my high school are screwed. That's true of Zoomers I've met across the country. There's this underlying what I'd call Zoomer holocaust, where Zoomers just got so massively screwed over by the system they're in because they often, and I don't want to call out people from my school because this is just normal, they often lack abilities, decision-making process, jobs, and almost no one dated in my high school or partied. People were just working so much there wasn't time for that. My high school experience wasn't that fun. It was cool because there was a lot of eccentric stuff going on, and it's heartbreaking to see an entire generation get broken. I think this is more common than anyone realizes for Zoomers. I've met Zoomers across the country, and the normal thing is that they're psychologically broken, which I've talked about in multiple videos. This is for a series of complex reasons. Between helicopter parenting is a huge factor here, which was terrible, where I had friends where their parents would walk them 4 blocks to school until the end of high school and then pick them up at the end of class. They wouldn't let them have the responsibility for walking back. I had other friends where their parents were going to move to the state they went to college in to follow them there, or that they controlled their spending as until they were out of high school, where they said, this is how you spend your allowance. And these kids just never developed a sense of decision-making or independence for what they need as adults. My entire generation, or really their parents, were obsessed with going to college. And, for example, I remember there was a girl in my class who had an hour free for senior year after she did her college applications, and she burst into tears because this was the first hour free she had gotten in years, and she felt so horrible. She felt she didn't know how to handle having a single hour free, so she was crying in the hallway. And it was stuff like that. It's just my generation's been screwed, and I'm sorry. And parents would talk about getting into college when I was in 3rd grade. This was completely deranged, and the entire system forced that down my throat. And none of it worked. Your college doesn't matter anymore. I met lots of people from Harvard, and they're still screwed. Just be a useful person with useful skills. It's more important to churn out a person who could actually live the world than it is to get someone who gets into, I don't know, UPenn. Growing up, everyone wanted to get into UPenn. That was like their entire life aspirations. And like 2 people from my high school got into UPenn. And so I was working as a janitor at my mom's brewery, and I also did a lot of paper pushing. I talked to the other employees, and I basically realized the job market was fucked because they would constantly complain about they were not satisfied working for my mom, and so they trusted me, so they'd tell me about life sucking. And I could see how desperate people were in the jobs market. So I basically made a rationalistic calculation that the only way I could succeed as an adult was by being an entrepreneur, because I couldn't develop in the system that had ruled society through the bureaucracy, because I knew the bureaucracy hated me, and I knew that I just assumed I was going to work a minimum wage job because I didn't know what else I was going to do. There were no opportunities around me. Like, I don't know what other people's lives are. Do people like, I don't even know what it looks like to have opportunity out of college. I don't fucking know, dude. Yeah, but I remember I couldn't sleep at night. I suffered insomnia in high school. I remember staring at the ceiling, thinking of various schemes so I could be an entrepreneur, because I knew there was a limited window before society fell apart where I had to become successful entrepreneur in that limited window. So I had crippling anxiety about how do I become a successful CEO before society falls apart, because in high school, I sensed in my gut that the world order would collapse because I had stabbing pains in my gut when I was 16. And I had imagined the city of Philly getting shelled and destroyed. And so I sensed it on an energetic level, which is why I studied geopolitics. And I read 10 books on China when I was in high school because I thought the great threat to America would be China. So I studied China really deeply. And I was obsessed with China defeating America and becoming our geopolitical, defeating us geopolitically. And over time, I'm very thankful to realize that China's got as many issues as America, and their birth rate especially. So I'm going to just throw in some stories from high school that don't really fit together but are fun anyway. So I want to honor my school's math teacher, Herb Kearns, who was an awesome dude. And I just like shouting this stuff out. He was really nice to everyone in the class. He's a moral person. He was one of the people who was nice to me when when I was suicidal when I was a teenager. And I just like shouting people like this out because there's good people in the world and you have to respect them and honor them. And it's nice when you see a good person who's respected by the community they're in, because those are the kinds of people that power human history. My school had a gender studies class, which I took senior year. This is how left-wing we were. And gender studies the teacher was pretty cool as well, where she was like this 30-year-old Irish American lady, and her attitude was, I don't care what you say as long as you position it in a rationalistic argument. So the gender studies class was fun, where I learned all this leftist social constructionist propaganda, but she was happy to have me argue the point back to the class, because she said me arguing against the point forced the class to get their arguments better. And so for my final essay for it, I wrote about why I thought we shouldn't have gender relativity, and she gave me a 99%. I got a 99% in my gender studies class. My best friend was a Chinese American guy from Shandong, and my school system was they took in about a third of our class were Chinese students from abroad, which were going to American school so that they could go to an American high school, so an American college could process them as we know that they have this level of quality. Because it's very important, because otherwise American colleges cannot assess the level of a Chinese high school. So what my school did was they took in out a third Chinese kids. My school was mostly gay and Chinese people, and then they charged the Americans 80% less the ticket fee using the Chinese to subsidize them. But my Chinese friend and I, we would get drunk a lot, and he had a bunch of different sub-businesses. He was from a wealthy family in China, and we kind of bonded over our innate entrepreneurial sense. And so he had a deal with Chinatown where I'd go hang out and I'd drink and I'd eat in Chinatown in Philly, which is a great place. And he would translate for Chinese businesses as his job. So he'd go to Chinatown and then he'd talk to the Chinese store owners and he'd do their American paperwork. And in exchange for that, there was a liquor store where they let us buy alcohol underaged for 1/3 the ticket price. And we would get... They didn't speak English, so Four Loko, which is what we drink, which I'd never drink that now. It tastes terrible. They'd call it Fourlock. So we would just get cans of Fourlock and then hang out at his apartment and just get plastered together. And that's what I did for senior year. And my friend and I, we were the ones who threw after prom. And I remember seeing everyone from my high school get blackout drunk for the first time. And they started talking about relationship drama. I remember thinking at the time, I'm too polite to tell you this, but I do not care about your crush. And my Chinese friend and I, we stayed together for like a year after the channel got big, but he was kind of a dick and he was kind of disrespectful to me, which is, I've had like 3 or 4 Chinese friends and they all try to exploit you. That's what I consistently find. Chinese people are very short-sighted, or they're in their relationships, they're very exploitive, especially if they're from communist China, which stripped away their culture. I have such fond memories of a bookstore called The Book Trader, which is on, I believe, 3rd and Arch Street, down by Penn's Landing. I've been there hundreds of times. It was right next to where I lived. We lived down in Old City with my mom, down by the Delaware, and I would buy, I think I bought dozens to hundreds of books from The Book Trader, because it's this used bookstore where they have all this historic material. And so my speciality in World War II era history stems from when you grow up in Philly, there's a huge oversupply of history books because it's such a historic region. And so when I was a teenager, I wanted to understand how the world worked. So I bought I bought whatever books I could have, and I wanted to study science initially. And what I found as a teenager looking into science is that science had basically become a new priest class where you can't learn it unless you're part of the university system that tells you the science. So I studied history instead because I could get a complete history education from my school's library and from buying $4 books at the bookstore. I'd like to thank The Book Trader for making all of their books $5 so I could actually buy them. And my entire library of century-old books is from that place. So I'd like to thank you for that. My school would have my school would have assemblies almost every single week. So we'd have church on Wednesday, and then we'd have assemblies on Tuesday. And with the assemblies, I had a bet going with my friends 2 years in a row. First year, every single assembly that was about race, I get a quarter. Literally any other topic, my friend gets a quarter. I made money. Second year, trans identity and sexual identity. Every assembly on that topic, I would get a quarter. Anything else, my friend would get a quarter. I made money that year too. So they were just shoving this leftist propaganda at us all the time. And I went to a school with a member of the Doherty clan. And for those that don't know, Philly is almost a hereditary monarchy where there is a ruling the ruling family, or the electricians union, the Dohertys, they're Irish political bosses, and they control Philly's politics, and they determine who wins in the elections. One of my friends was campaigning for a candidate against the Dohertys, and it was just ridiculous because the Doherty candidate was going to win. And of the top 10 donors to the Democratic Party, the only union is the Electricians Union of Philadelphia in the top 10 donors. The only city is the city of Philadelphia. So the Dohertys control Philly. They have thugs beat up their opponents, but they hold on to power, while Philly has gone into decline due to the socialist policies they push and deindustrialization. And the centralized government doesn't call them out because they are the top donors of the Democratic Party. But the guy I went to school with was really cool. He was a great guy, and he invited me to a lot of different events. He took a liking to me. And then he was inviting me to football games. Every single football game I was supposed to go, my dad had another thing that weekend, so I couldn't go. But it's weird that I was pretty close to... I just find it strange because my life has so many different timelines, and that was a timeline where I intersected against it, and then I didn't go there. And another moment is I went to a music concert I think it's the Jay-Z concert. It's on JFK Boulevard. They block out the area around the Art Museum. And I went there with some friends, and we were at a Nicki Minaj concert. I was bored. I walked around. I wanted to see the concert. Some people from my school saw me there. They said, you should hang out with us. And I remember being in the front because my friends were more extroverted than me, so I went up to the front, and then it was Nicki Minaj music all the time. And I thought, this is literally hell, because Nicki Minaj was screaming, ass, 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 ass. And I was being jostled by, like, white 13-year-old girls next to me, and I thought, I was having sensory overload. And I thought, this is legitimately hell. And I just want to highlight this, where there was a moment after it was senior year, it was April of senior year, and I had just finished all my college applications, and it was a Monday night, and I was partying with my Chinese friend, and I was drunk, and I was getting on a train from Jefferson Street Station to go out to my dad's house in the suburbs. I remember sitting at the train line. No, this would have to be 15th Street Station, not Jefferson Station. I remember looking out over the city. And Philadelphia was so stunningly beautiful. It was this beautiful line of lights stretching in every direction, and I could see all the old architecture. And Philly is such a beautiful city because it was the most important city, or the second most important city for most of American history. And I thought, thank you so much, God, for giving us this world. Thank you for this beautiful moment that I will hold on to, looking out over the city past midnight, waiting for the train, because I will hold on to this moment forever, God, so thank you. Speaking of Chinese guys, there was another very interesting character who went to my high school, and I see him in some ways as a Chinese equivalent to me, where he was from Sichuan, and he was in America, and he was just insane. We were the same age, or he was a year or two older than me, but he could speak over 10 languages. I once cleaned out his apartment because he's a traveler. He lived in Europe, he lived in China, he lived in so many different places. So he travels around the world, learns languages, he learns knowledge. And when I once cleaned out his apartment when he was leaving, when he was moving out after college, to go to college, and I took over 100 books from his place, because his place, the entire room, was just books. He had a mattress. The mattress didn't even have sheets. He slept on that. He had books under the bed. He had so many books that it was literally the entire room. And he would constantly berate and insult people. And he would talk about how naive Americans were. Where one time in class, he said that his grandpa was black and cooked friggin' fried chicken. And then people actually believed it because they're that naive. Or I once took him home for Thanksgiving because he didn't have any family in America. And he told my cousins that they ate deep fried panda in China. At the same time, though, if he's my Chinese parallel, he's a sociopath. He was a legitimately bad person, and he was rude to everyone, and he was abrasive, and all my Chinese friends have tried to screw me over at some point. And secondarily, he had no interest in underlying depth, where he was just constantly learning stuff to look impressive, look impressive to basically get laid. But it was trying too hard and too direct. And so he would just learn different topics. He had 1,000 books, and he read little bits of them, but he was unable to gain knowledge. He just kept waffling around. He had difficulty keeping friends and that stuff because he was going through this peripheral, very direct experience of life. And I think there's something deeply archetypal about his story, where it's very high intelligence, very interest, but the lack of the actual motivation to do stuff and the sense of cynical, nihilistic disaffection from your environment. I nearly forgot to throw this in, but I was part of my school's quiz bowl team. And quiz bowl's like Jeopardy, but with a team sport. And my school kind of drafted me into this. I didn't have that much interest in. And then the first time I went to quiz bowl, for one of the games, I was the best new player. So my class kind of drafted me into doing this. And I didn't like quiz bowl that much, but then the social pressure was there. And we performed nationally. We would go in a bunch of different... we'd spend Saturday days doing quiz bowl. I really wish I didn't do quiz bowl, if I'm honest. The other guys on my team were assholes, too, because they kept on trying to get me to study for quiz bowl. And because there's these packets you go through and you do them. And I said, I just learn information. I learn what I find useful. It happens to be good for Quiz Bowl. That's not my intention. I derive no positional advantage for studying for Quiz Bowl, which made the other guys in my team really resentful against me. I scored one of the top 10 best players in the country at one point, though. That was fun. Oh, no, sorry. Best 10 players in the state. I apologize. Difference. My life has so many subplots that I forget subplots to the main story, and then I forget subplots which are part of those subplots in turn. So, when I was doing Quiz Bowl, I formed a cult around the god Crom. I did this because I was bored before a match, and I started praying to Crom so that we could crush our enemies, the other team. And then it worked. We kept praying to Crom. Kept praying to Prom. We kept praying to Crom, and we kept winning. And then I formed a religious cult in the Quiz Bowl team where I had like a hat and we had an idol that we would worship. It was fun. And Crom is, I got it from the Conan the Barbarian story where the Sumerians are proto-Celts in the Conan books. The Conan books are super fun. You should read them. They were written by Robert E. Howard, a native Texan. And so Crom is the Irish version of Odin. And he is a fertility god, and he's also a god of magic and wizardry, and he's considered a good god. Crom is also the god behind Halloween. And then we started losing a few games, and the coach of our team, the guy who had appointed himself leader of our Quiz Bowl team, he said we had to stop worshiping Crom because it wasn't increasing engagement. My mother was born in Canada and is a Canadian citizen. My family on my mom's side have been Americans since the Mayflower, and the reason she was born in Canada is because her parents were dodging the draft during the Vietnam War. And my mom saw getting me and my sister up to Canada as a way to get legal independence from my father, so she kept on forcing me to do it. And she kept on forcibly trying to get me and my sister to move to Canada multiple times as a legal way to control us. And my sister sided with all of this. She became basically a puppet for my mom. My mom would bribe me and my sister when I was 10 to leave my father, and she said she'd give us more Christmas presents. And I told her no, and my sister said yes. So my sister stopped seeing my dad when I was like age 10 or 11, and I remember my dad, my sister, and I were supposed to go on vacation to Austria, and then my sister just didn't come on the vacation. So my dad and I didn't go to Austria, And my sister just said she refused to see my dad. And this was a big court issue, and this really broke my dad's heart because he loved my sister. And my sister believes all the conspiracy theories my mom said, that my dad has bands of thugs and he has malice and whatever, that crap. And my sister just did what my mom told her for the rest of my life. She moved up to Canada with her. She got a job in environmental science, which is my mom's obsession, was improving agriculture. And she became a lesbian because my mom would say growing up, marriage is slavery and a woman shouldn't get married. And I will pay Valentine to not get married. And I think if marriage is slavery, you made quite a lot of money being a slave and your conditions are pretty good. And my mom would get us to spend summers in Canada, and I hated them since she abused me so much. She was in a constant psychological psyop where she would constantly say that I was going to move to Canada and I was going to live there and the courts would side with her. She would just psyop me 12 hours a day. It was ridiculous. I hated her so much. I started fighting with my mom over this, and I would argue with her every single day. I got off on insulting her, and I would literally start fights with her on purpose to vent my hatred of her. My mom unironically tried to send me to Canadian military boarding school, and I refused to go with my mom for Canada for one summer. I just stayed with my dad, and then my mom sued me. Or she sued my father because you can't sue a child, but she was saying my dad was conspiring with me to break the contract she made. And so the court sided with me in the legal case, and they gave me control of my own custody when I was like 14. My mom basically gave up at that point and let me spend more time with my dad until he had near full custody by the time I graduated high school. I was suicidal when I was 14. My parents were forced to go into counseling by the Chester County court system. The counselors told me that I could tell them I was suicidal and that I could trust them because they were worried about my mental health and they wouldn't tell anyone else. They then told both of my parents and used it as a negotiating chip to force them to come to terms to end the counseling. And they betrayed me and lied to me. And my mom's reaction was that I was doing it for attention. I wasn't actually suicidal. And my dad's reaction was that, oh, Rudyard was suicidal in the past. It's fine now. I don't have to worry anymore. And, oh, God, I'm just so tired of this bullshit. And every night I would put myself to sleep thinking of ways to kill myself. I would relax by thinking of ways to kill myself. And I had a 5-step plan, starting out with cutting my arm to feel like my life energy. Then I would jump off the Delaware Bridge, the bridge that spans New Jersey and Pennsylvania, to a icy death to die in the Delaware. That was how I wanted to go out. And I have an ability to feel the world in my body. This is how I run this channel. I can feel you. I can feel my audience. I can feel people I talk to. I can feel different societies in history. I can feel all of your emotions in my body. I have this ability. It's a curse, actually, because you have terrible emotions. You're all super depressed. Society's falling apart. But when I was a teenager, I realized that everyone was miserable and the current system wasn't working. I could feel on a psychic level that the system was breaking down around me, that the global order and everything I knew would fall apart. And I predicted the global order would collapse in the next few years. I thought it would be nuclear war at the time, or like a major global war. And this is what got me into studying geopolitics, which I really got into around age 16. I would go into crime-ridden ghettos like Camden and North Philly to see if I would die. I could sense the enormous frustration building up about deindustrialization, which hadn't been loosened. I still couldn't believe anyone talked about the obvious decay. I would think about deindustrialization on a daily basis, and it's the most important part of my political formation. I just assumed it killed any chances I had for success. I never thought I'd amount to anything in high school, and I assumed I'd be working a minimum wage job. I knew something like Trump would happen, and I didn't know what it would be, but I knew that deindustrialization was big enough. The elites completely betrayed us, and the Rust Belt's got a population more than Germany, edging up against 100 million people. And 100 million people got screwed over by deindustrialization. And the thing is, the media would never talk about it. And growing up, I was shocked my entire area got screwed over, and no one talked about it either in where I lived or in the media. We're that much of sheep. And when I see deindustrialization, I saw a civilization in decline, and I assumed the West was dying, and I projected Pennsylvania onto the entire Western world, where I just thought the West was dying, and I would pray to God, very frequently, God, if you let me save my people, I will do literally anything for you. I know my people are dying, and if you can do anything where I can help them, I will serve you until my last dying breath. And I would modulate my... Oh, I didn't finish that segment. Yeah, so I would walk around Penn's Landing. Penn's Landing is this area where you see New Jersey. It's the Delaware River. And the Delaware is a huge river. The Delaware is wider across than the Rhine, the Nile, and the Mississippi. Or the Mississippi gets slightly bigger. But the Delaware is a friggin' huge river. And I would look at the USS New Jersey. I'd look at the industrial decay, because this used to be the biggest shipbuilding. I think it was the biggest shipbuilding center in the world at some point. Sorry, guys. This is candid. I gotta leave the alarm in so I'm identifiable. So, yeah, Penn's Landing, huge former shipyard across the river in Camden, and it's all of these old factories and shipbuilding centers, and I saw 2 ships pass. I walked at Penn's Landing nearly every single day. I was with my mom in Philly. 2 ships passed. Biggest shipbuilding center in the world. It's fucking dying. Camden, New Jersey is apocalyptic. I'd walk across the river. I'd look at Camden. There's fucking barbed wire everywhere. And Camden used to be one of the wealthiest cities in the world. It's where Walt Whitman's from. And I remember just looking around thinking, socialism's what killed Philly. I walked across the river to Camden. Camden's as bad as things can get. Camden's like a city in South Africa. It's one of the most violent cities in America. And Philly is this tiny edge of civilization, because half of Philly is habitable for white people and the other half is just, you'll die if you go there. There was a time where I had to bike through a few blocks of bad neighborhood in West Philly because I was biking from my dad's house out in Chester County to Philly. And my sister and my mother called me crying because I was going to bike in this 2-block dangerous area. And I didn't block through there. And then I didn't bike through there. And then my mom said afterwards, I don't believe you. No one believes that you changed your route. And I thought, okay, Mom, I have literally no incentive to work with you because you're going to punish me even if I make the correct decision. And the Rust Belt was so ridiculously obvious growing up in Philly, where Philly has a smaller population today than it did in 1950. And Philly was one of the wealthiest cities in the world a century ago, and now it's the poorest and most crime-ridden of America's top 10 cities. And going around Philly, the decay is so obvious. It's rotted out industrial buildings. Nothing new gets built in Philly. It's abject decline. And it's so obvious. This is where America started. And I lived a few blocks from Independence Hall, where I would, in the place where the Constitution is. So I'd walk past it on a daily basis when we'd walk the dogs. Philly's surprisingly cheap, so you can live a few blocks from Independence Hall and have like a middle-class life. This is what makes Philly so great. Yo, I gotta throw this story in as an example for just how messed up Philly is. When I walked to school, and I'd walk to school, it was like 10 blocks, I saw a dead man in a heat vent for 3 days. I just saw the body. Every day I saw the body. And no one dealt with it. None of the cops cleaned up the body. I just saw a fucking dead body when I commuted to school. It's kind of like when I was in Chester County, when I would take the bus, and every single day on the bus route, there was a deer corpse, and I just saw the deer corpse decompose for a month, and every single day as a kid, I would look at the deer corpse and just think about it gradually getting its life eaten away. It was pretty formative for me. So I'd modulate my emotional state through assessing my emotions on any given day, and I'd have an emotional diary. And my emotional diary that I'd keep in high school was actually a big turning point for me, because every single day I would write down the inner emotions I felt and what I was thinking about. So I had a degree of third-person objectivity about my life, because I didn't trust anyone, and so I could only rely on myself. I remember I once looked at a Lego, and I thought, this Lego is the only person that understands me. I was like 11 when I did that. That's so sad. But I added up all the days, and at least half of the days in my life to 2/3, something really bad would happen. I would either fail a test, my mom would force me to do tango dancing with her as a 12-year-old boy with adult women, or I would get sick. Every single day something bad didn't happen, I would thank God for it. I would tabulate, did something bad happen today? If something bad didn't happen, I would say, thank you, God. At least nothing actively bad happening is good. And I remember it was a cold winter's day, and I was suicidal that winter. I was 14, and I took a test. I was so cut off from my own emotions. I took a test, do you have anxiety? And then the test told me you have crippling 9 out of 10 anxiety. And my dad's new girlfriend would abuse me. Jennifer Jensen is an administrator at Lehigh College, and she would insult me at the dinner table. She told me when I was 15 that I was too immature to succeed. Almost every time we talked, she would insult me. She said I wasn't ready to go to college and that I reminded her of the stupid, immature lacrosse players she worked with. And one time, my dad, Jennifer, and I went hiking, and then there was a change in schedule where Jennifer got angry at the change in schedule, and so she recommended a course of action. I said, that would be really inconvenient for me. And she started screaming at me, what the fuck is wrong with you? Inconvenient for you? And she would say, your dad spoils you so hard, like inconveniencing you is nothing. And she said she would tell me and my father that my dad cared too much about me and that my dad spoiled me. She would fall into histrionics due to me not citing academic sources in casual conversation, or because my dad scheduled his schedule around his custody time with me to spend time with me, and she got resentful of this. And I viewed all of this as an insult to my honor, and I fought back. My dad would side with her over me. Things got bad enough that I refused to ever speak to her, and once I threatened to burn down my dad's house for insulting his honor over Jennifer. Or my dad and I are both from honor societies, so you get stuck in these weird situations where you're not allowed to back down. I did this with all of my parents who were from honor cultures. We just ramp up the ante, and at a certain threshold, you can't back down. And I felt trapped, and I literally allied with my mom at one point against Jennifer to spend more time with my mom. And I hate Jennifer more than I hate my mom. My mom is so schizophrenic and evil that she kind of becomes a nuclear reactor of pure evil, and I can't really dislike her anymore. She committed to the bit hard. And Jennifer is just a resentful bureaucrat. I can't respect that at all. And one time, this is one of the most important days of my life. It was past midnight, and I couldn't sleep at my dad's house. I suffered insomnia in high school, so lots of days at school I walked in with only 4 hours of sleep. And constant exhaustion was how I remember high school. And my high school experience I remember closely as I would get home from school, and then I'd watch Todd in the Shadows content as I passed out in the hammock in my house. And back to the story. So it was past midnight, I couldn't sleep, and I was thinking of the first step of killing myself, which is cutting my arm. And I had a big kitchen knife in my dad's house. I put the knife up against my arm. I thought, wait, Rudyard, if you have a knife, and a big knife, why are you using it on yourself and not against the world? Because a knife is a knife. And then I realized the only thing that matters in life is honor. And that if I lived a terrible life, everything is outside of my control, I'm constantly screwed over. If I lived with honor, my life would be worth living. And that is the day I turned myself around and I decided not to kill myself. And I see this one day as the turning point of my life that allowed me to reach where I am now, because in so many timelines, I kill myself as a teenager. And I'm so grateful I didn't. And I lived life as if I was already dead for the rest of high school. Every single day I would tell myself, you already died, Rudyard. You're just playing the game further. And I became addicted to heavy metal. I would listen to heavy metal 5 hours a day. Sabaton, Flogging Molly, Nine Treasures. Because heavy metal would just power me off adrenaline because I was constantly exhausted. And looking back on my high school self, it's like I was permanently powered off meth. I was just deranged. And, like, heavy metal was my identity. And I fucking hated everything. I was so disaffected. When I was 16, I cried for over an hour in my room alone at New Year's that Jennifer kept insulting me and that my dad kept doing nothing about it and siding with her. I remember crying so loudly, and then I would realize no one ever cared how I felt about anything. I realized that no matter how much I was hurt, my dad wouldn't care or stop Jennifer. No one would ever care about my immense suffering at any point. The only thing that matters is that I'm useful to others and provide them services that they trade me for. I had another time when I was 16 when I had a concussion. My mom refused to acknowledge I had a concussion since she said if she did, people would say that she caused it by hitting me in the head. I also had a fever. I also had a fever where I had 23 canker sores in my mouth, where I asked my mom to get me some soup to eat, since it was the only thing I could eat due to the sores. Canker sores are these little sores in your mouth that makes it really painful to eat, and you feel pain in your mouth. I had over 20 of them. She then said I had no right to cry, since I had... Oh, I skipped ahead in the story. Oh, yeah, so she refused to get me the soup, and when I got the soup myself, she insulted me. I then burst into tears and told her that I was going to leave her to spend all my time with my dad. She then said I had no right to cry since I had all brought this on myself, and it was all my fault. These two experiences were so traumatic for me that I lost the ability to cry for over 6 years because I thought no one would ever care how much I suffered, so there's no point in crying. This was the point my life turned around. Once I didn't kill myself, I was able to stabilize psychologically. At that point, I just wanted to move to a small town in rural Pennsylvania, get married, and write some books. I wanted a simple, happy life. I wanted normalcy and simplicity so much to counterbalance the suffering of my life. At this point, I made the decision I would either become a historic figure that would change the course of history, or I would die trying. There were no two other options. And there were 2 books that had a huge impact on me at this critical juncture. The first being the Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, and the second being Winston Churchill's autobiography. The first was the Stoic philosopher and Roman emperor, his bedtime writings, where he thought about philosophy. And it's all about maintaining rationality and objectivity in a world where you're not in control and only caring at things you control. That was spiritually super important for me as I became a Stoic. And Winston Churchill's autobiography, he wrote it when he was 24, which is my age, to reflect on his youth. And I saw all the great things he did, where he was a hero in the Boer War, in Cuban War, in Afghanistan, and he was a great man, where he wrote all these... He was a historian, and like me, he nearly failed out of high school. He was not popular or cool in high school, and then he changed things around as a young man to be epic. And when I look at these great men, I thought, I find these people identifiable. I can understand who they are, and I can see what made them great, because they made a decision to be great, and I can study the underlying subcomponents and then model it myself, because if anyone can do something, I can figure out how they did it by studying their work. And I don't understand when people say things and they don't realize there's the wisdom of thousands of years. Your ancestors are here to help you. They wrote lots of really, really smart books that are smarter than anything you'll ever write. You should study your ancestors and their wisdom to be better. And I had this great question in this part of my life. I could see other young people, and I didn't find them identifiable at all. The things they worried about didn't even register to me as options. I never thought of the drama they did, or was obsessed with dating or any of that. I was single-mindedly obsessed with my own honor and my intellectual studies. I realized I only had half of the emotions other kids around me had. I knew I wasn't a sociopath, but I was pretty worried I felt so few emotions. I would just walk around Philly feeling numb, and I wonder, why do I feel so numb and angry all the time? The only emotions I could identify with rage, stubbornness, and some sense of peace I never felt. I decided then that no one would ever understand me, and so I would try to do as much good as possible for the world in hiding, trying to change outcomes towards the better because people wouldn't understand me, so I'd have to work in the shadows. I remember I had a punching bag in high school at my dad's house. I was so consumed with rage that I knocked the punching bag down at least 6 times before rehanging it just to punch it down again, only to finally give up after 6 times. Gotta throw this detail in before I move to the next segment, but I was terrible at driving. I only passed my driver's test on the 5th time because I was so numb I couldn't perceive my spatial area very well, and my mom and sister would mock me when I was practicing driving, saying I wasn't doing it well. And as a kid, I was so mortified about not passing my test on the 5th time. I thought, I'm never going to tell anyone. And now here we are. Because I thought as a kid, when there's this voice in the back of my mind saying, I will tell people if I become great enough that I no longer feel insecure about not passing it. And I've reached the threshold, so thank you, life. Yeah, I had several different minor driving accidents in high school. It's nothing that destroyed the car, but stuff that nicked it and hurt it. When I graduated high school and turned 18, I felt so liberated. The day I turned 18, I wallowed in the shower for 2 hours in joy that I was finally legally free from my parents. I immediately started hiking the Appalachian Trail, which was what I always wanted to do after school ended. I didn't actually want to go to college, so I went on a gap year to forestall it. I was so excited to go on my gap year since I hated society so much and I wanted to avoid the system. I remember my grandma said she wished I planned more for the Appalachian Trail and that she was worried that I'd get hurt, and I said, the reason I'm hiking the trail is because of bullshit like this. And I thought to myself, I need to walk an extra 200 miles to prove her wrong. I had only ever camped twice before in my life before I hiked the Appalachian Trail, and I did it myself without anything else. This was a week after I turned 18. I hiked 600 miles from the top of Massachusetts to the bottom of Pennsylvania. For those that don't know, the Appalachian Trail is a wilderness trail along the American East Coast that stems from Georgia to Maine, and the way it works is that you can often walk 5 days and see no civilization. You go into towns periodically, you buy up ramen and other things you eat. Then you keep walking, and there's these sheds every 10 miles you can sleep in that are three-sided. So you just walk for months on end in the woods, and there's other hikers as well. Man, that was a crazy time. My shoes were too small because I picked a pair of shoes that weren't big enough, and so one of my toenails came off. I had to claw it off with a Swiss Army knife. I also went swimming in one of the most stunningly beautiful places I've ever seen, Paradise Lake in upstate New York, where the trees are so tall, the grass is amazing, the lake is so beautiful, and I think heaven looks like that. I caught a leech when I was skinny dipping in the water in my hand, and I had to burn the leech off with my stove, because if you pull a leech off, it sinks its teeth in, so I had to use fire. And apparently I was in Massachusetts at the trail at the same time as a serial killer, which is one of the few times that's ever happened in the Appalachian Trail in its whole history. The Appalachian Trail is super safe. It's way safer than America in general as a society. And one time I refused to sleep in a shed with someone else because I didn't like talking to other people, and then I was stuck in a tropical storm for 12 hours, and it was so hard to carry the water, get the water out of my bag, and that really humbled me. I also spent a night with a cult leader in upstate New York where I was sleeping under a bridge, and the bridge was great because it had cell service, it had a water source, it was near civilization, and then people kept walking across the bridge, and they had no idea the Appalachian Trail was there or why a guy was sleeping there. The first group of people who walked by were teenage girls who who were just gossiped on the bridge. The second group were these UPenn students who looked at me, and they thought I was homeless, and they woke me up at 6 a.m. to mock me. And then I impressed them as a hiker. And then at the end, one of their friends called them, and he said, hey, don't bother me, I'm talking to my man, the hiker. Where they said, hey, where do you get water? And I pointed at the river, and they said, how do you shower? I said, I don't. And they said, why are you doing this? And I said, I don't know, I don't have anything better to do. Third group was this nice Vietnamese lady, and she's part of a cult called the Moonies, and she invited me to stay at her place for 2 nights, and she had pictures of these cult leaders all over her house, and she moved out to that area to be nearer to her cult center. She was very nice, though, and when I crossed the bridge from New Jersey to Pennsylvania, I was sleeping in the basement of a Presbyterian church, and one of the best parts of the trail is people in rural America are so stunningly kind. It's just unbelievable. Like, I'm so grateful to these people. And they'll do so much stuff for you. They'll leave out water on the trail. They'll let you sleep in their houses. They'll let you sleep in the basement of their churches. They'll offer you food. And I was going up in Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania, up in the Poconos, which is an area I love. And I was climbing up a mountain in the thunderstorm. I put my pack down for a second, walked away, and then a 10-foot branch came in at exactly the angle that would snap my neck. And I had just stepped out of the way, where if it didn't, it would have easily killed me by cutting my head off. And I try to be thankful to God that I lived, and I have returned to there 3 or 4 times to give little offerings to that land, to thank it for not killing me, because I am grateful. And I made it to southern Pennsylvania, and by that point, I was just tired of the trail. I mean, the thing is, I went to the trail to learn life lessons, and I learned those life lessons in 600 miles, not 2,000 miles. And there's only so many lessons a bunch of fucking woods can teach you. And I was in a lot of physical pain with my foot's the easy example we saw good before. The skin on my back was literally peeling off due to my pack. And I lost 20 pounds in less than a 2-month period. I caught giardia because I was drinking unfiltered spring water, because hiker custom is that if it comes out of a spring from the rock, you don't have to filter it. And I got it wrong because it was the river that was kind of above ground, kind of below ground. So I caught giardia, which is an intestinal disease caused by deer shit. And my dad had to pick me up outside Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And I was sick for 3 weeks at his house. For some of the life lessons the Appalachian Trail taught me, one is that you don't actually know who you are until you've been in a dangerous, existential life situation. Like, there were times I hiked out into the Appalachian Trail and I got lost, and it's literally dozens to hundreds of miles to the nearest civilization. And I finally made it back to the trail. But in that moment of getting lost and thinking I might actually die, your life gets so real. Same thing as well with, there were long periods where I just had no water and I went to bed really thirsty. You don't know who you are until you're lost in the woods really thirsty. We've gotten way too complacent. Secondly, on the Appalachian Trail, I learned that masculinity is performance. It's not the ability to brag. Where I'd hike these difficult mountains and I'd think, the manly thing to do is hike the fucking mountain, not brag about hiking the mountain. I have to actually hike the mountain. And the trail convinced me that I was a man, and it gave me a degree of objectivity from the rest of my life. Because my life is quite overwhelming, and being out in the woods by myself made me realize that, first of all, people were objectively very mean to me in my childhood, and I had every right to be resentful for that. And secondarily, that society and the constant alarms and the schedules and the morass of constant enumerating and constantly thinking is making us miserable. Because when I was out in the mountains, I felt happy, and I felt this sense of profound peace and ability to go with the flow that I didn't feel in my previous life. My previous life felt fake, and the Appalachian Trail felt real, in that it felt like I was touching the spirit of the world, that there was this beautiful, almost Lord of the Rings-like place that exists as a parallel dimension on this earth, and we've blocked ourselves off from it. We've purposely blocked ourselves off from the fantasy and mystery of the world, which I could feel on the Appalachian Trail, and that was a conscious decision we had made as a society. I went to China that summer as well, and this was a very formative trip for me because I thought a lot about China as a high schooler because I worried they'd displace America, and I had many Chinese friends. And you can't convince me that country's not industrial Mordor. I've been to like 20 different countries in the world, and China is the one that scares me the most. And I could pick up on the vibes, that's my thing. And I felt so sorry for the Chinese because I like Chinese civilization. I collect Chinese watercolor paintings as one of my hobbies. Chinese cuisine is one of my favorite cuisines. I've read thousands of pages on Chinese history. There's a beautiful core to that civilization, but then communism's done terrible things to it, and I couldn't get the help but get the worst vibes seeing China because all the trains ran on time. It was massive. You drive for hours with skyscrapers in every single direction, and it goes on longer than you could ever possibly imagine, the industrial scale of things. But I also knew this was a fundamentally evil society. There's cameras everywhere. I could sense the totalitarianism and the misery in the air. It looked like the Chinese were just overworked and forced to live in a soulless society based around greed. And I feel sorry for them, but going to China was a turning point in my life, and the air is completely polluted and disgusting because I looked at it and I thought, I need to avoid that. And there were cameras everywhere. Whenever you went into a hotel, you had to get your fingerprints, they checked your passport, and they got your eyes. It's a totalitarian state, and we're not far from it. It was around late August or early August, I finished the Appalachian Trail. And I had the rest of my gap year where I had to figure out what else to do. And I decided to do a language program in France and to do a archaeology program in Peru for the rest of my gap year. And I was super pumped to do that. I was in Montpellier in the south of France for 3 months, and I loved being there. I went to a really good language school and picked up a lot of French in that time period. They use a really excellent teaching system where you have to have conversational understanding in order to learn the language. It fits with my empathy thesis later. And I had to walk through a Maghrebi neighborhood every single day on my commute to the school, and I was pickpocketed there. I got into a fist fight, which I won. I was slapped in the face twice, and I was also served rotten food. When I was in France, the Yellow Vest protest was in full swing, and they blocked off the downtown of Montpellier, periodically knocking out windows, and I went on a date with a girl while there was a literal explosion a block away. The air felt very tense in France at the time. I read the book The Great Wave about secular cycles when I was sick there for a 3-week period. I was just in my bed. And that book is what convinced me to move from alternate history content to anthropology and geopolitics. And this was a really important period of my life for intellectual development on a holistic basis. My read on France is that it's a wonderful country. It's like looking at a painting where every single detail is done perfectly. The French have spent thousands of years turning their land into one of those beautiful gardens in the world. And the French understand how to enjoy life. At the same time, I'm so glad my ancestors left Europe, where I would not want to live in Europe now, because I just go completely crazy at the just lack of social mobility and lack of activity. They're so complacent over there, and they just hate excellence and greatness, and they're nihilistic. After France, I went to Peru for a month. I had planned to go there for 3 months, though. I was working on a Wari site. The Wari were a civilization about 1,500 years ago up in the Andes by Cusco called Pictayacta, and I worked at the Inca site Sacsayhuaman. Get your jokes out now, which was the Inca holy site. And I was working with an Irish archaeologist there who ended up there in a crazy story. We would categorize Wari artifacts. In the Wari civilization, a lot of it's from before the time of the Prophet Muhammad. And I saw a mummified head from then. And also we were categorizing a lot of pornographic art because sexuality is sacred in their society. We would joke about what to write in the classification for the porn art, how much to say to describe what the object is. And Peru's got a really warm place in my heart. I was staying in a clan compound about a dozen families that all lived in a gated community together. They were all descended from the same grandfather, and they did all their business together. They socialized together all the time. They threw parties together. And even they'd have stuff like one of them would have a puppy, and then they'd share the puppies among all of their family members. And I could tell that it made them happy, but that would drive me crazy. I can't, I don't want to spend that much time with my family. I'm sorry. I feel beyond mortified that I nearly forgot this, but this is such a good story. When I was in Peru, I ran into my childhood best friend from Chad's Ford. His last name is Gerstenschlager, which is the most obnoxiously German name that has ever existed. And, I was part of this like business for 18-year-olds from the West who could go to developing countries and do certain projects. It's become like a class thing now, if I'm being perfectly honest. And so he was part of their program for like helping children there. It was part of this program. They go around the third world and help people. It's a fun, good thing. No, I'm not going to overthink that. There's probably third world politics I'm forgetting, but that's not useful for you. And his roommate was this German dude who was super cool. There were all these really cool Europeans there, some attractive Scandinavian young women. I had fun when I was there. It was cool. So the virus, the famous global pandemic from 4 years ago, was hitting after I was in Peru for about a month. And I had a Chinese friend, the one who I did forelock with. He called me up, and he had some contacts back in China who worked at a hospital that said that this thing was really crazy and you had to take it seriously. So I got a flight out of Peru the next day, and I left an extra hour plus to get through Lima Airport rather than what I would normally need. However, there was a huge line due to COVID, and so I made the last flight on the last call because that night Peru closed its border. And Peru had a really crazy COVID lockdown system where they would have cops out in the street and they would um, they would stop you from leaving your house. And this was really controversial because in Peru, out in the Amazonian region in the jungle, they have massive deaths from dengue fever. And I don't know if exactly dengue, it's one of those tropical illnesses, vastly more than COVID. But the Peruvian government cared about COVID because it was the politically sensitive topic. And so, yeah, I got out of Peru on the last call for the last flight. And I had friends in Peru who were stuck there for months until their European governments got them out. I caught COVID in Miami airport and I was sick for 6 weeks. I've had COVID like 3 times in my life, and this time was the only one that was really bad. And I was coughing up phlegm for, again, over a month. My dad kept me in my room so I wouldn't get him sick. Man, COVID was brutal. I remember counting days until lockdown was over, and I had a Chinese friend who was stuck in America for complex reasons, so my dad and I took care of him for a few months until he could get a flight back to China. I think COVID was a real point of social trauma that we haven't actually healed from as a society. I think we don't really know what happened with COVID or how it relates to our lives. And so it bubbles up under the surface as resentment because we never psychologically processed it. And I see COVID as the tipping point where things really went to hell, where before then, and Trump before then, there was more plausible deniability that we were in an okay society. And then after COVID, I thought there was going to be a recovery that there wasn't, and things went straight downhill. And I think especially for women, it's the period of just psychological collapse. I think psychologically we never recovered. And I was stuck at home during COVID, and this was a real turning point for the channel. I was just stuck at home with bored out of my mind and physically incapacitated. And I knew that this was an opportunity I'd never get again with a lot of free time. And so I started working on my channel full time. I worked really hard every single day of the week. And I remember it being really hard to maintain focus since I was in physical pain. But I worked because I needed something else to do to not go completely crazy. I kept trying to make alternate history videos, but past a certain point, I realized that I had basically completely saturated the market. I was working with timelines like, what if the cotton gin was never invented? Or what if the Shimabara revolt actually worked? That summer of 2020 is when I made the shift to the anthropology, history, and geopolitics content that I make now. Being stuck at home during COVID was one of the most important periods of my intellectual development, in which I read possibly a majority of the top 10 most important books of my life. I had nothing else to do. I met the man who would become my right-hand man, business manager, and best friend in March of 2020. Merrick Wright was a 21-year-old guy from Boston who was unemployed from a homeschooled working-class Yankee family. He had 6 siblings, too. He emailed me saying that he wanted to make maps for me, and I looked at his maps, told him no, but I said, "You make maps of my videos," and this was alternate history time period, "better than the maps I have. We should start talking to each other." And so we started talking every week for at least a year, where we became pretty close friends. And I told him he was a loser who should turn his life around, and I realized that he had incredible innate talent, and no one else had, because he's from a working class background and never went to college. And he got a job at that point working at Dunkin' Donuts, then he worked as a gardener. Then I started hiring him for various tasks. It started out just managing my email, then it began managing my business contracts, then my other business. Then I use him video editing. I use him for a sub variety of different tasks. He's very intelligent and does a great job. And within a month of meeting me, he actually met the girl who would later become his future wife. And Merrick has recently moved to Texas, where I'm at, from Boston. And it's crazy that there's lots of people like Merrick. There's lots of very smart people from working class backgrounds who basically get shoved aside by the system because they're obsessed with college applications. And Now he works for me full time, and I could never ask for a better friend and a better lieutenant. It's been a great ride, Merrick. I went to college for a semester as a freshman in Bates, a liberal arts school in Maine, an hour north of Portland up in the woods. And the brief time I spent in college was kind of lame, if I'm honest, due to the enormous COVID regulations they had. The school was even more woke than my high school, which is kind of hard to believe. They were trying to make critical race theory a part of the curriculum that was just mandatory for you to pass the class. And at that point, my channel really took off because I made a lot of successful geopolitics videos. So when I was stuck at home with Peru, after Peru, I had 666. I had 66,600 subscribers. I was stuck at that for a year. The Appalachian Trail really slowed me down. And then I was at 200,000. And 130,000 was when I hit a real tipping point with my channel where I could live off the income. And I voted for Trump in 2020 since I realized the left just wanted to destroy white men. And this was a big turning point in my life since it was when I decided to explicitly be a conservative. It's funny that being a conservative is such an important part of my identity now, but it's a relatively recent thing. And I started to really distrust the left with the Summer of Love or the post-George Floyd protests. People I thought I could trust from my high school or my hometown in rural Pennsylvania were just posting completely demented stuff. Stuff where it was totally obvious to me that these people wanted suffering and the destruction of civilization. People would say you should donate furniture to butch lesbians, and dozens of people were saying that black people doing property vandalism was justified and taking the richest property was fine, which is just ridiculous. And I started to really loathe the left on a profound level after this. December of 2020 is probably the most important month of my life until I dropped this video. I got a check from Google for $12,000, which blew my mind, and I realized that was enough money that I basically had to drop out of school. The other thing is that a handsome young man named Matthew DeMarcantonio hit me up. He was a 26-year-old tech CEO who ran a company in the restaurant payment processing business from Teal Capital. That failed, and then he moved into a business where he was basically making OnlyFans for normal content creators. And I think it's a pretty good business. It was just wrong timing for the market. And he is a right-wing, hyper-militaristic guy from a State Department family in Virginia. His dad is the former Undersecretary of Defense under Clinton. His dad's an awesome dude. I've spoken with him. One of the people I'd say the highest of. He was a big fan of my show and was part of a secret social club built by someone from Team 10, or Jake Paul's organization. It included NBA stars, Netflix actresses, billionaires, and a successful founder. And not a successful founder, many successful founders. I was super happy to join them, and the guys who were part of the organization loved me. I was widely known for once dressing up as a pimp on a call and making map-based sexual innuendos to a film producer. She was female, it wasn't gay. Sadly, it was one of the worst managed organizations I have ever seen in my life, and immediately shut down within a month of me joining. The founder, Max Beaumont, is a sociopath who I still hate in my mental book of grudges. Side note, in the culture of my people, both of my parents told me to memorize every single social interaction in my life and then assess it on, is it a direct or indirect insult, or are they demonstrating a lot of loyalty and morality? So I automatically just assess the world on my honor code, and then I try to vastly reward those who are loyal to me. And if you fuck with me, don't fuck with me. That's just my attitude. And Matt hit me up that winter and said he was going to Mexico with 20 of his tech CEO friends where they would rent out a bunch of villas on the beach. I said yes and dropped out of school to live in Mexico in Playa del Carmen. Playa is commercialized enough to feel safe, but it's also pretty Eurotrash, if I'm honest. I joke Playa is a more Anglo suburb. It's like an Anglo suburb of Miami, and it was a blast where we stayed on the beach and we would party 3 or 4 nights a week. I'm glad I did it, but I wouldn't do it again. I was so tired of partying just after a month. And Mexican nightclubs don't have volume control. It's the danza kuduro is stuck in my head forever. I was really rich at the time, and I was making 200K that year and 300K the year after that. I don't know why people think I'm poor. This channel's got a lot of viewers. I monetize said viewers with sponsorships. You guys think I'm like a homeless incel or some crap like that. You're probably just projecting. And we were living in nice villas, and I didn't spare any expense. I miss living in the third world. You can hire someone to like clean your dishes and like give you weekly massages. It's so nice. And Matt D brought a bunch of his frat bro friends from Virginia, and I basically lived in a frat for 3 months. This was actually a really vital time in my social development and my development as a person, because I came from an abusive, nerdy family and a Christian private high school. And so living with these frat bros in Mexico taught me a lot of social skills that I had missed out of. And I think a lot of you will go through a degenerate college phase. It's a formative experience. I was rejected by a girl I liked, and so I went through a 3-month keto phase where I lost a lot of weight. I had gained weight during COVID. The girl turned around on me after 6 months, but then I had found a new girl by that time already. I went on a date with a different girl who used ayahuasca, which is an Amazonian psychedelic the native peoples use, which lets you commune with the spirit world. My childhood dream was to always talk to God. It was always the thing I most wanted to do in my life. Other kids fantasized about being firefighters or astronauts. I just wanted to listen to God all day. I wanted to talk to God as a kid since my parents had told me that all things stem from God, and if you don't know God, you don't know anything. My dad would say growing up that most of the social issues in our society are downstream from the death of God. I could tell even as a child that my people were dying, and no one knew how to fix it or that it was even an issue. I thought, why don't I just call God to see if he has anything to say? I always had a childhood fantasy of saving my people, and there was always this whispering voice in my mind, which told me I needed to touch base with God for me to reach my destiny. My mind periodically whispers to me. It's something where I'll just be living my life, and a thought comes out of nowhere that I never considered before. I then spend years pondering it until it makes sense. Some things my mind has whispered to me include, you need to talk to God. Another, once you understand consciousness, you understand everything. Third, time is an illusion. Fourth, everything around you is mutable and can be broken with your mind. Then there is a master key to all things. Once you take the master key, you control reality itself. My brain just feeds me this stuff without my consent. I don't know, man. This is my life. I'm stuck here. A final reason I was really excited to take ayahuasca was that I felt completely numb when I was partying in Mexico. I remember it was my phone stuff is candid. So I remember it was my birthday and I was at a water park. I just felt nothing. I remember even being in the water and feeling no emotion on the slide. I remember one time I was walking on a beach outside our villa, calling my dad, telling him I felt nothing. I just felt complete emptiness. It reminded me of college in France, times where I should have objectively been happy, but I just felt inner pain. Both times I remember thinking, my life is objectively good now, but I feel miserable. I felt like there was an elephant inside of me. That locked inside my own mind was something I really needed to know, but I didn't. That I needed to find out what that thing was in order to move to the next stage of my life. I had no idea what it was, but I felt its absence. I felt so exhausted all the time, like a horse forced to run all day. I couldn't rest. It was a feeling I could have for as long as I could remember. Like back in high school, when I remember experiencing less than half the emotions I saw other teenagers have. There was a girl I went on dates with for a few months. I loved her more than I could ever imagine, since she's what I thought I wanted as a checklist for a woman. She went to Harvard, she was beautiful, was anti-woke, really smart, and other stuff. We would get drunk walking around New York with a flask of vodka in our backpack. It didn't work out for a variety of reasons, and she was trying to manipulate me for social advancement. She once criticized me, calling our friend crying, that I didn't convince her to stay overnight at our place, where she drove 2 hours to stay at my place at nighttime. And then I made a move on her and she said I wasn't interested. I said, okay. And then she left and then she called my friend crying saying, he didn't make me stay. And moving past her was really difficult, and it was a big part of my development because it involved throwing away my concept for what I thought I wanted out of life. And I had had this sort of romantic sense that I wanted a peaceful, stable, happy life. And I realized I didn't want that. That's lame. I want to go hard. And I don't want to base my identity off romantic relationships with women. That sounds lame. I have to stand alone as a man, and I need to stand alone before God. And I didn't know what I wanted in life before. And I projecting traits onto others that you wish you have is not romantic. It's weak. When I thought about how I loved her, I realized my brain wasn't really on my side because my evolutionary circuits weren't wired, where my self-interest was I had to move on. She was the kind of person I thought I wanted, but she was crazy. However, I realized I got off on arguing with her. In that, I enjoyed blowing off steam and getting into fights. I realized this was an issue I'd have to fix to live a happy romantic life. I knew something was off with my romantic senses that I had to fix. I would do anything to break through the other side. I literally did the psychic equivalent of dropping 7 thermonuclear bombs on myself. Ayahuasca is really no joke, guys. I'm so happy it exists. It's like touching the edge of the sun. But ayahuasca is to LSD or mushrooms what a house cat is to a tiger. It was made by the Amazonian peoples 1,000 years ago because their shamans knew that there would come a great empire to the west that would have a sickness of materialism and greed, which ayahuasca would have to clean out. Of course, as I've said dozens of times before, I do not support illegal things, and thus please only use ayahuasca in South American countries it's legal in. Also, please use an Amazonian shaman like I did. The shaman is a trained professional where this is what they do. You really, really need one. If you don't use a shaman and bad things happen, it's your fault. You'll probably be fine either way, and nothing too bad will happen. However, this is playing with a thermonuclear bomb. Even if you have a bad trip, it'll help you grow because you're probably a pussy anyway. I was able to reach the spirit world, and I did it through purely ethical and responsible use of drugs. Hola, ¿cómo estás? I hope you can see that I'm wearing the Tree of Life t-shirt I have for this video. So, I don't even know where to begin explaining what I saw on ayahuasca. I saw so much of the spirit world, I could make a 2-hour video just from it. I had the most insane trip of anyone I've ever heard of. I took 7 rounds split apart by a 3-month period. The recommended dosage is 3 in a row with a shaman at a facility catered to this. We were in a beautiful location with running water and a garden inside a cave with adobe huts built into the rock. The way it works is that you basically take these shots like vodka, and it's this filthy chocolate dirt liquid. Then it gets stuck in your body for 6 to 12 hours. Psychedelics hit me twice as hard as anyone I've ever met. Probably genetic reasons. And your trip will likely not be as crazy as mine. I spent something like 70 hours in the spirit world at least. I have 800 contacts in my phone, and I have spoken to God and the devil more than 90% of people in my phone. I have hours, and keep on, I have a photographic memory. I have hours of recorded discussion in my mind with multiple spiritual forces, whether God, the devil, Mother Nature, time, the anima, etc. So I have a relatively good knowledge of the spirit world, and they've explained me multi-hour philosophic discussions about the underlying nature of reality. I'm going to talk about things that I saw thematically rather than in order. It's all really a jumble. The spirit world is innately incredibly deceptive, and everything is everything and yet nothing and yet other things and yet themselves at all times. It both makes sense and is a retarded jumble. And that's just the paradoxical nature of reality. What I've heard is that if you have an incorrect theory of the world, 100% of reality is deceptive. And if you have a correct view of the world, reality is innately 20% deceptive. Unless you're wrong. You're often wrong, and always wrong in certain ways. The spirit world operates off technicalities, and it operates off hidden clauses where you look at the Constitution. Our founders created all these different systems to protect the different kinds of government, and tyranny always comes to the technicalities of things the founders never thought about. The way psychedelics work neurologically is that your brain has certain subconscious wirings that you naturally form over the course of your life. Inside Out, the Pixar movie, covers this in a really great way. And the mind operates like a radio tower in which certain species, through a biological basis, or even different civilizations, wire the subconsciouses of people in a certain way on a biological level. An easy example of this is if you look at anthropological studies of Westerners and Easterners, when you ask them to prioritize certain things in a story or a painting, they'll pick different details because they perceive reality differently. And keep in mind how enormous reality is. It's infinitely large, and thus it's impossible to perceive everything. Thus, we create certain filters for how we perceive reality. These are partly genetically wired and also cultural, which is why you could be genetically identical to someone from the Bronze Age, while they would see dryads and gods and spirits in the world and you would not, because the cultural expectations of your society wire how you perceive consciousness. Psychedelics have been in use for religious reasons for all of human history, in cultures ranging between the ancient Greek Eleusinian rituals, which inspired Plato or Pythagoras, ancient Hindu Soma, and we have very significant amounts of evidence the early Eucharist was a psychedelic. I saw many things between heaven and hell, so much so that I can't even begin to describe the totality of it. The spirit world is innately mischievous and built off lies, as I said before. Thus, even using words to describe it is often a fool's errand. I have seen things I cannot even articulate to you, given they exist outside the human frame of consciousness, and yet are so clearly real. I have seen 1,000 years pass in a single instance, and the sheer enormity of the human experience as expressed in that time with each individual soul and each individual life. I have seen 1,000,000 suns crash together at once, creating such a level of cosmic destruction as to lead back to nothingness. I have seen the whole of human life concentrated into the great chain of being, and the whole of cosmic beyond human, all the animals and gods and spirits contained within the great chain of being, stretching empowered from the lower levels of pettiness and evil to God at the top. I have seen 1,000,000,000 lives at once, and in which you know the individuality of the living whole in the human spirit or the mind of God feeding off the individual lives, with all of someone's life clustered into a single vial that is their consciousness. I have spent more time than I would ever ask for or give to my worst enemy in hell. Hell is more horrible than you could possibly ever imagine. You don't even have words for the agony. The suffering is so truly great, it shatters your being, rupturing throughout your soul as you feel agony, and yet your body has already disintegrated, while your suffering encompasses the whole world at once. The suffering is so enormous it breaks space and time, so much so that unique moment is edged into history as being a time when pain could break the nature of man himself. As so many mystics have said before, hell is a place the mind crafts by its own design. God doesn't send us to hell. Almost by natural law, we guide ourselves down there if we deserve it. The afterlife is when your soul hits infinity right when you die, in that you jump out of time, and you are stuck with yourself forever. If your soul is stuck forever, it will lead towards good or evil, and that is the nature of your afterlife. You must firstly, when you die, see yourself for who you truly are. If you had to talk to yourself for 1,000,000 years, what would your interaction with having to deal with yourself be? There are 1,000,000 hells, whether that of psychological torture, physical pain, cold, or heat. Hell is yours. All of them share the feeling of being trapped. Hell is a mental loop you put yourself in that you cannot break out of. I suffered physical pain in hell you can't even imagine in your worst nightmares. The worst pain you could ever imagine is barely at all what hell could be. I had demons torturing me, ripping my flesh apart. My entire body was viscerally on fire in a way where every atom screamed with the most horror it could feel at once without dying in that instant. You have no concept of how much I have suffered and how long I have spent in hell. I spent something like over 80% of my time in ayahuasca in the spirit world in hell. It was truly a terrible experience in which my concept of time was stretched out. So I spent an infinity of time in hell. I think consciously there's still a part of me that's there stuck in infinity. And it was a truly terrible experience, but having done it, I have lived. There is no greater living than going to hell. This is so cool, guys. And having seen hell made me realize everything in my mortal life could not compare to the depth and the enormity of the divine. For the first time, life did not feel boring to me. I spent dozens of hours speaking to the devil. I don't even dislike him at this point. Much like my mother, he's so evil he kind of circles back around, where I realize he's just a wolf hunting sheep. He's a cold nuclear core which radiates suffering to others, which he himself does not feel, since at the eye of the storm everything is calm. The devil was quite civil with me and polite. He said that I didn't belong in hell, that under normal circumstances I wouldn't be there, and I had to pay a cosmic debt for my bloodline. After I paid the debt, I could go back and change my life. The agony of hell became the worst upon the deep realization that I never belonged to be there, that I had been cast into the worst suffering a man could feel for no justice of his own. I was stuck in this mental loop that was killing me. The mental loop was the idea that since consciousness programs reality, that because I perceive myself to be in hell, I would be stuck in hell forever, in all of eternity. I later realized this is the evil loop, or the closed circuit, which lacks humility or the evidence of the outside world, and allows the rationalizing of the greatest evils. The end point of Nazi Germany and communism is from the closed rationalistic loop. And this is the origin of atrocity and totalitarianism. This happened multiple times in a row, in multiple nights in a row. My entire body and sense of self shut down due to the horror of hell. I had to have my friends counsel me at the time to not kill myself. Damn, I can't believe it's still hot in Texas in December. But back to ayahuasca, I felt the weight of history on my shoulders. I felt the choices I made would determine the lives of billions of people in the future. I felt in every inch of my body the desire to reject the responsibility. But then God said, I know you won't do that because you care about people and you know that this is your duty. God told me it was my duty to found a religion and that in the process of trying to not found a religion, I would do so anyway. He said that I never consented to this, but that my bloodline did for me. I told him I didn't want to, and he said, I don't care. He said that he knew I was a man and I would accept my responsibility. He said that my sense of honor was seen as a cosmic force to him in its own right, that this very moment I was living in would become historic. I also spoke to God when I was on ayahuasca. It's frankly hard to attend church anymore after seeing the God Christians claim to worship. I really don't know what to tell you, but I don't think the God a lot of you are worshiping is the one in the Bible. I hate to say it, but I suspect for some of you it might be the Lord of Lies, dressing in Yahweh's garb to tell you further lies. And the Bible does a pretty good job of describing Yahweh, especially the Old Testament. And he is like seeing a million suns crash together at once. Our mortal brains cannot comprehend his excellence and scale. He's more similar to a Lovecraftian monster, all things considered, than to the God mainline churches preach about. Yahweh's power is so enormous you would find it to be horrifying. He demands your loyalty with every fiber of your being. He is an irresistible force of gravity which sucks you in, for he is the only thing that has ever truly existed. I could see into the mind of God, and I saw it as divine clouds. It's the great mist of consciousness in which all things happen. The mind of God is all human experience lived at once, with each moment being a beautiful choice with a tapestry of such awesome beauty, you can't help but thank him for the extreme wonder and horror of it. The great chain of being may stretch down to hell, but by its very nature it leads fundamentally to heaven. Higher forms beat lower forms, thus meaning evolution guides us to be more like God. The sense of profound beauty I felt for the 5% of ayahuasca I spent in heaven was so enormous that it gave me the will to live through the hell. That 5% of beauty made the entire suffering of my life worth living. I knew that God was real and that I could reach him. God said that I would have to take responsibility for my future at some point. That it would feel terrifying, but at the same time, I would feel enormous peace after making the decision. He showed me that once I moved through my suffering, I would attain an inner peace, wisdom, and sense of direction that I would physically be incapable of believing at that stage of my life. He showed me the mental state I would have as a middle-aged and older man, and I felt such awe at my future development that it made all of my suffering worthwhile. He said that my decision-making and conscience would come to understand all 9 worlds of the Tree of Life, that I would gain a sort of connection to the anima mundi, or the experience of lived consciousness itself, so I could empathize with the human condition itself. He said this would be my great gift to humanity, showing us the whole tree of human experience so that we could love each other for our differences. I saw hell below and realized it powered heaven and all the worlds between. When I looked down upon the suffering of hell and I asked God, how do you do it? He said, don't stare down too much, lest they drag you down there for no one's gain. I saw a million dreams of the future, and I'm unclear which are true and which are merely fantasies. You shouldn't take the spirit world that seriously. A lot of it's deception. And I think frequently of Lord of the Rings, where you look into the Palantir, and the Palantir is the bad guys, or Sauron's fantasy of the future. It's not the real future. And that's something to keep careful for all of this. And I'm an empiricist. I say this crap. You're here to disprove it. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. I'll change my ideas if they're incorrect. But I saw AIs grow so advanced it's impossible to distinguish from reality, and that we would upload our souls onto some kind of spiritual cloud. I saw that the government would move towards making 1984 a reality, and that men would be able to manipulate the minds of others to send them to hell. I saw that I would start to perceive consciousness differently. Finally, I saw I would live in a time where the dance of life would stop, where men and women would stop mating with each other for no fault of my own generation, but there would be extreme worry about our species going extinct. I saw that it was my duty to fight against this. I saw that my place was to be a man who stood for men, that this is what I had to do. I had a profound sense of sexual inadequacy, which I realized was completely undeserved. That made me realize I was forced to feel inadequate about being a man for no real good reason, that I had been tortured by purely evil and nihilistic people. I was talking to the shaman while I was tripping, and she said, Rudyard, I see your destiny is to stand for men since the feminine has been kicking them around. I could feel the cosmic dance of the masculine and feminine break down. The dancers refused to show up for the match or even try. That this would be the great question of our time. That this would be the question under which our people lived or died. There's a few hilarious details I have to throw in here. The first is that the first form God came to me in is as a Zoomer bro, because he said that that was the form I best understood, and the way you interact with the spirit world is a two-way process, where when you perceive the spirit world, there's this divine semen, where semen can imprint on a variety of different women in different contexts to produce a different child. So you're interacting with the divine semen, where as you interact with each other, something new comes out, which is why these underlying archetypes manifest in different societies around the world in different garbs, because they're interacting with different environments, where there's the underlying timeless semen. I'm going to keep saying it because I know it makes you uncomfortable. It's funny to watch you squirm. And so when I was talking to God, God said, I can only explain the world to you. And he was doing this in Zoomer slang, by the way, like yo, bussin', no cap, cringe, whatever. God did not say those words, but that's the kind of vibe. And for example, your level of social understanding of information is the highest density that God can give you information for. And he said that the breakthrough I'm describing came out due to the computer revolution, which allowed a more advanced breakthrough in how humans process information, where the previous level was the book level, where the Abrahamic religions were established in the highest level of complexity of human data is the book. Or it's why societies around the world have beliefs in dragons but never existed, where the dragon is this archetype that manifests in a series of different subcultures. And when I met God, I first spoke to him, I said, give me proof to show that you are real. And he said, I'm both real and I'm not real. I am a voice in your head, but I am also God. I am both. And he said, I cannot give you information that you yourself do not search for. And he said, once you trust me, I will give you more information, but the lubricant of faith is the thing that allows me to transmit information to you. So until you trust me, I can't give you any information. So take the leap of faith and trust me. And then after that, God fed me all the information. I saw that we were about to enter a spiritual dimension called the Halls of Time, that I was the first man to stumble upon the Halls of Time, which are one of the most dangerous parts of a species or civilization's development. This was when we as a species have to grow apart from purely being ordered from God. We have to take responsibility for our own development, and it's the equivalent of a teenager or a young adult having to leave their parents to fully realize their place. This is a very dangerous level because your fundamental understanding of what reality is breaks down. You realize concepts you thought you could take completely for granted, like time or existence, are vastly more complex than we realize, and the real answers are harder to find than you could ever possibly imagine. And that this is a period where we have to stick together and hold each other accountable and make sure we won't go crazy, because the line between madness and sanity will grow very, very thin. And it's my responsibility to get my people through the halls of time. And the halls of time are also where souls come from before entering the body, and where many evil spirits live. That once we truly understand the nature of time, that everything would change. I could see that through all the chaos of time was my immortal soul, which lived in a cave by itself, pondering all things while helping those who needed it. I saw that my entire life was the unfolding of a destiny that I made choices in time to, but which all played out according to a plan. Free will and predestination are both the exact same, in that God sees over time, in that time is an illusion of the passing of a single moment of decision, in which we truly live. I saw that through all the suffering, my life still did fundamentally make sense. I was at one with Mother Nature. I could feel the archetypal feminine force of nature, that which underlies all concepts of religion and philosophy. I imagined myself as a woman giving birth. I felt such horror and compassion at the female condition, their feelings of complete powerlessness with the world, how they're forced to shove a football-sized baby between their legs and not die, how their physical weakness was so pronounced they were dependent upon others for survival. I saw the feminine as driven fundamentally by fear and terror, and out of that is the chaos that allows new life. The feminine was its most dangerous when it's scared and has to be held back from raw chaotic collapse. The final part of my spiritual journey I saw would result in me allowing life to grow after me. I saw that what I just did would allow trees to grow and buildings to expand. I saw that life had won against death already. As long as that happens, I won, and I already won. Later on, as I researched these things, I found that an ancient Egyptian philosophy called Hermeticism had an almost identical similarity to what I saw of the spirit world. When I was on ayahuasca, my overwhelming first impression was that the Platonic archetypes and Carl Jung were completely accurate. I just saw the archetypes. Peterson was right to say a short answer. Ayahuasca basically fried my brain. I'm still shocked at how deranged I was. As I healed from the PTSD that came after ayahuasca, I always assumed that as I grew healthier, I would be harsher on how reckless I was as a decision. The opposite happened. I fucking love that I nearly killed myself to go to hell. What's the point of living if you're not going hard? As you'll see later in the story, I can be psychotically brave. I kept going back to hell since I could sense that it was my duty from God. When God tells you to do something, you do so immediately without hesitation. God demanded I suffer in hell 7 times for me to clear a generational curse. I have no other choice since my duty is to listen to God, and there's not an easier answer. I'm always shocked how my parents would talk about honor all the time and duty and courage, since them being part of a very specific American subculture and ethnic identity had such an enormous impact on the rest of the course of my life. And it's really another anthropology example to stick to the theme from this video. My family had told me growing up the worst thing a man could do was to be a coward or to back down. And I'm not a coward because I am a Lynch after all. And it's crazy to see cultural stuff my family gave me inform facing hell in the rest of my life. And I have complete faith in God. I knew that he was the sun that determined whether I lived or died. I had stood before multiple gods. This shocked them. They couldn't believe a mortal had done this. And they said, "Mortal, how did you do this? Most of you did die by this point. You can't handle hell." And I said, "I know I'm Rudyard William Lynch. I know that I exist, and thus I know I cannot be destroyed by another spiritual force, and I know as a fundamental fact of existence that I exist. So you can't kill me." And so my guide to the spirit world was just refusing to die, and so I saw various cool stuff. I was a total vegetable after I finished ayahuasca. I slept for 48 hours straight after 2 nights with no sleep. I then missed my flight back to America, and I flew to Boston since my father and I had been fighting over Jennifer, and I didn't trust him at that time. Merrick took care of me for 2 weeks in my vegetal state. For the time after ayahuasca, I felt as if the spirit and physical world had been so intermeshed as I could see one spilling into the other in active time. I could see the Platonic archetypes manifest in the physical world, while I saw the connection between all of things. And I saw that everything is fundamentally an extension of all things. So when you see one thing, you are seeing the fundamental nature of all things. And that may sound like BS, but it's still true. I couldn't sleep one night, which was too horribly going to become my new normal for the next few years. At 2 a.m., I felt the divine will move through me, and I wrote a 10-page longhand in my notebook. I was in the hotel lobby for a few hours writing ideas straight, and the janitor walked up to me and said, "Hey, I can see that the will of God is moving through you, because when I write church music, I look like how you look now." And that longhand script I wrote later became the video for the manifesto of the New Right. Almost everything in that video is dictated to me by God. And that includes the ideas of consciousness evolution, our reality being a Darwinistic game in which God has certain rules which we follow to win, and on top of that, the greatest need of our time being decentralization. Watch the video if you're interested.